across this room, what you do and say is being recorded and broadcast, okay? And so this is, I kind of like this part because this is where open meetings and open records intersect, okay? Because somebody can be watching you and you pull out a document and they tomorrow send an open records request and want to know what was Ms. Crumley referring to? Well, we just had an open meeting collide with open records. And you can see that nothing you do is, if it's done correctly, is done in a vacuum or in an isolation of the responsibilities to conduct your affairs openly and with public input and participation. There are some basic requirements of Open Meetings Act. One of them is that your decision-making process is open to the public. There is no private deliberations at the advisory board level. Your discussions are open, and if there's ever a question about anything that you've done, if there's ever a question about whether or not you violated the Open Meetings Act, the decision will be made with this standard. And the standard under the Open Meetings Act is that it is to be construed liberally in favor of open government. And so any question comes up about your conduct or we will resolve that with the eye of it didn't meet the standard, because we're going to be liberally construing open meetings, and we're going to liberally construe it against you, okay? Because it's to be interpreted in favor of open government. That's our point of reference. Can you as a group or a body make decisions outside of this meeting? No. And I say that no, it's kind of a no-brainer, but there's no such thing as submitting a proxy or somebody voting for you. You got to be in the room. You got to be present. And one of the most important things we're going to talk about later on is when we get to the quorum piece, is that if you're in the building, you're not in the room. If you're not in the room, there is no quorum. And if there's no quorum, we can't take any action. So in the foyer out there, it's not in the room. You cross the threshold to the door there, now you're in the room. No brainer, but I don't want to assume anything in terms of expectations. Now, quorums. The Act defines a quorum as a majority of the governing body. How many people on this board? You got a quorum. The point being is that it's not a majority of those who are present, it's the majority of those who are on the board. And that's kind of a sticky point sometimes because people want to say, okay, well, the people who are here, it represents a large segment of the board members, but not a majority. You got to keep that in mind. That's going to come in very handy when we get down to discussing specific instances, potential violations. The key is going to always be a quorum. And so you got to be mindful of how many members are on your board, and which will then dictate whether you can have a discussion on a particular topic or not. The Open Meetings Act says that the meetings are conducted according to Robert's Rules of Order. A lot of times people want to use Robert's Rules of Order as a mechanism to shut down discussion or to delay. We're not talking Robert's Rules of Order in that context. We're talking about Robert's Rules of Order in the context of an orderly meeting without gamesmanship, okay? Because that's how we're going to be interpreting what's going on in these meetings, is that if it's a play on gamesmanship, well, you know, we're not going to go down that path generally, because we can always find a way to have a discussion and have it orderly and consistent with the Open Meetings Act. How do we get to an open meeting? Notice of an open meeting. Notice and the agenda are terms that are used interchangeably. And the reason that is because when the agenda is prepared, the agency sends that to the Secretary of State's office as the notice of the meeting. So you hear agenda and the notice, consider them to be one and the same, because they're actually, it's the same document. What you have in front of you as your agenda is what was sent to the Secretary of State as a notice. Deliberation. What's a deliberation? According to the Act, a deliberation is a verbal exchange during a meeting between a quorum of the board and another person concerning an issue within the jurisdiction of the board. Elements. Deliberation is a verbal exchange during a meeting between a quorum of the board discussing the business of the board. You have all those elements occurring in order to have a deliberation. The problem is that people try to word game. Well, we were discussing, we weren't deliberating. Doesn't cut it. Because there was a verbal exchange. You met the four criteria. It doesn't matter what you call it. If you meet those criteria, it's an open meeting. Can you have a nonverbal exchange? Yes, you can. If you're circulating documents around amongst and between you, you've just had an open meeting. If it was a quorum, if it was sent to the quorum of the board, if it was about board business, and the other elements are met, you've had an open meeting. A lot of times, sometimes you'll find yourselves in social settings where you all don't actually do this full time. So you have there are other things you do in the industry, in your occupations. You may be at an association, and you may be at a gathering of any kind, and there's a majority of you there. Well, once you engage in discussions about the board business, got a quorum present. You got a quorum present. You got an open meeting. And if you engage in those discussions, you just violated the Open Meetings Act. I want to take a step back because I think it's also important for you to understand that I've yet to read a single case where anybody is set out to violate the Open Meetings Act. You read through the literature, most of what they talk about are violations that occur inadvertently, not thinking, nobody intended to do anything, but just the circumstances that existed gave rise to an open meeting through no fault of anybody's, just inattentive to their surroundings and who was present in that meeting. Do y'all have to be in the same conversation to have an open meetings violation? No. If two of you over here having a discussion and three over there having a discussion, neither group was a quorum, but a quorum in that one conversation. But collectively is what we're looking at. And collectively, we have 5 people in the room discussing board business, different issues, but board business. You run into problems. So you want to be mindful of that. In the same line of thought of having smaller groups in the same room or a part of the same discussion, remember I told you that quorum was the key word we were looking for, one of the key words we were looking for? Well, there are situations where you can have 2 members on the phone and they conclude their discussion. One of those people will talk to 2 other people on the board. You've just now had 5 people engaged in a conversation, and that is a no-no because that's what they call a walking quorum, okay? You cannot message between 2 subgroups of the board. Example being work groups. If you're in a work group and there are 2 members or 3 members in that work group, if those members, any one of those members were to contact another board member and say, oh, guess what we talked about today? It was an interesting meeting. And they start to summarize the content of those discussions in the work group, you just had an open meeting because you can't carry that discussion under the pretense of, well, we didn't have a quorum, because you just created one, because you just walked that meeting down the hall and you created a quorum. So you got to be mindful of those kind of issues as well. Walking quorum. Social media. Social media is a scary topic. It's a scary topic because it is an undefined area. In the last couple of sessions of the legislature, there was an attempt to kind of put some parameters around social media. None of those attempts really carried any substance. Social media scares me because it leaves a record of that discussion. I don't mean a record in the sense that we're trying to hide anything, but social media, you do a tweet to a group that consists of 2 members, and it's there. Next week, another board member comes along, reads those comments, and enter their comment. Even though there was a week difference in time, you've just had a discussion of a board business with a group of board members on board business. So it scares me because of those possibilities and the various combinations of ways that you can communicate inadvertently and engage a cross-section or a majority or a quorum of your board. So you want to be mindful of your emails. You know, you get those long emails, 30 people, and you look at the first screen, not realizing that at the bottom of that screen, you've got 3 other board members who are part of that email. You're the 4th, or you're the 5th. I think you see the point I'm trying to make here is that you got to be mindful when you hit reply to all. You got to know who you're talking to. There's a responsibility being placed upon you greater than you have in your normal affairs when you reply to email and engage in social media. There's just a whole array of different ways this can come up. And so the practice point here is social media, careful. Email, reply all, careful. You got to know exactly who it is you're talking to because it's all going to, there's a record out there that follows you around. And again, public information. If I see you on tweeting, or if I see you doing anything I can inquire about, it's fair game. And so you want to be mindful of those kind of things. Now, we've avoided all of the possibilities of engaging in an open meeting because we watch our tweets, we watch our email, we watch who's in a gathering with us. We all do all those things correctly. So how do you get to an actual meeting? I alluded to earlier about the notice and the agenda. Well, there has to be a notice requirement, the date, time, and place of the meeting. We can't say we're going to meet in this room and then meet down the hall. The meeting has to take place in the location at the time that it was noticed for. There's a host of requirements for the posting. Don't worry about those kind of things because there's a whole section in the commission. Their responsibility is to support you and to make sure that all your deadlines, timelines, all those things are met. I said in this presentation, just so you're aware, that none of this stuff is happening in isolation, and we don't expect you to do any of this stuff, but just be aware that it's taking place. And so when an email comes through saying we're trying to organize a meeting, it's important that you respond to those requests timely because, again, we're trying to coordinate all the schedules, and we're trying to make sure that the notice goes out consistent with the agency's expectations and requirements of the Open Meetings Act. I think I said earlier that most of your meetings will take place in an open session. You hear the commission going into the executive session, those things really don't apply to you because there's a whole host of requirements before you can actually close the session. And I have yet to see an advisory board where those aspects actually apply. And so don't expect to shield your discussions through an executive session. The rights of the public. You're all aware that in your meetings there is the public comments portion of the meeting, and I'm sure you've had experienced various times where a person had a public comment and it was near and dear to your heart, and you wanted to engage that person in a discussion, and somebody over there against the wall said, no, you can't do. And the reason for that is because, again, good government, Sometimes good government requires that a discussion not be had. And the reason for that is we're not trying to quash or to chill any discussion. We're trying to time that discussion so that it can be properly placed on an open meeting so that people who are aware and interested in that issue have an opportunity to know you're going to be talking about it and to attend and have their input be considered as part of that process. And so if the person makes open comment, there are some specific limitations, exceptions to that, but it is more along the lines of procedural and trying to, you will hear generally exec saying, okay, well, staff will take you offline and we'll talk about those kind of things. That's because we cannot have that discussion in an open meeting, and if it is sufficient enough or important enough, then we'll place it on the agenda and there'll be a full opportunity for everybody interested in that issue to attend and participate. And so when you hear public comment and at the end of your meeting, there'll be an opportunity to put items on the agenda. That's your opportunity to say, okay, in public comment, I heard this and it was interesting, I want to explore it. It goes on the agenda, next meeting, we talk about it forever if you want to. The point being is that discussion takes place after there's notice and opportunity for persons to attend, participate, or listen in. They don't necessarily have to be here, but the opportunity to transparency, again, is what we're after. And so, wrapping up your meetings, because you've complied with everything you were expected to, you've held yourself to the agenda, but sometimes in your discussions, you may have one item posted, and it evolves into something else. Don't be offended if somebody again over there says we need to curtail this discussion for the reasons we just talked about, because yeah, it relates to, but was it sufficiently implied or a part of the posting? And so there are people in this room who will be listening to your meetings. They'll be engaged in your discussion. But they'll have an ear tuned to have you straight from the agenda. And so if there's a perception, because remember I said again, the interpretation is in favor of an open meeting. So the decision that will be made over there, oh, this is straying off, and so we need to bring this tactfully bring this discussion to an end. And sometimes people will sit there and wait for a point in your discussions where it makes sense to break it. And so just because nobody broke in at the beginning doesn't mean that it was consistent. It means that it was just being respectful and waiting for an opportunity to chime in and try and bring this discussion to conclusion. I said earlier that your meetings are recorded. They're recorded not only on the internet, but you've got staff listening to you and keeping your minutes. And so it's important in your deliberations that you identify yourselves. A lot of times people don't, but it's good practice to get into the habit of identifying who you are as you make comments, so that way there's no question about who said what in the minutes that'll come to you for ultimate approval. And it's important you read those minutes, because if there's a mistake in those minutes and you don't catch it, it goes through. That's the official record of what happened in these meetings and in the positions you took. And so if there's misrepresentation of something you said, the opportunity to correct it is in your next meeting when those minutes are presented to you for your consideration. Now, this one, which is, I don't know if you can see it or not, but it's civil penalties and remedies. And there are some criminal provisions attached to open meeting violations, but again, I intentionally have not talked about those things because you're not going to ever get there. Because we're going to talk about ways that will keep you so far off that line that you don't have to worry about whether or not you've encroached, and the penalties will become irrelevant to you, not even a consideration. And so we want to talk about some best practices. We want to talk about meeting in small groups and communicating. Now, that's an easy thing to do because every board at some point establishes work groups. Be mindful. You can't go around, no matter how important the issue is, if it's open meetings, which I like to talk about. I kind of want to talk about it in certain arenas. And so you got to be very careful about small groups and in repeating those discussions to other members of your, I want to say commission, of your boards who were not privy or part to those initial discussions. Email and texting. Look at who is on that list, okay? It may be tedious to go through, but you something as a, let me back up. I left a very important piece I wanted to say, is that we're giving you some basic guidelines, but the best guideline that will keep you is a personal set of ethics, because nothing says that you cannot employ a set of ethics more stringent than the act. And if you do that, you will be so far off that line that penalties will never become a consideration for you, because your personal ethics, your desire for open government will control your conduct, and we won't be having these kind of discussions. And so, teleconferencing, Skype, all those things that are out there, they people engage in. You can engage in those things, but you got to be, again, careful and know who is on the other end of the wire. Can you engage in polling? You know, polling is where one of the somebody gets the bright idea. I'm not going to even come close to a quorum. I'm going to call one person on my board one at a time. And ultimately, you've called 5 people, and none of them constitute a quorum. They even know that you talk to the other people, but you just engaged in polling, and so you have committed a violation, and you have inadvertently sucked the others into those considerations, and they may ultimately determine that they knew nothing about it. But that's not the point. The point is that the appearance and the issues have arisen, and we engage in a discussion that we shouldn't be having because somebody stepped across the line, and so your personal ethics will again, based upon transparency, keep you off those lines. I'm going to conclude by saying that if there's ever a question about any particular conduct or action somebody's taken towards you, just any questions about open meetings, is that we, as the General Counsel, are here to walk you and to help you through those kind of issues. And so don't be afraid to raise issues, because we're kind of here, well, we are here, and one of our responsibilities is to help you navigate through open meetings, open records, and the APA. Any questions?
Any board members have any questions?
No, sir.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Francis, I just wanted to say that typically we have Charles do this presentation a little bit before Halloween, because it's so scary to hear him go through all that, but hopefully, I thought he was going to get out some Christmas gifts with his open records, open meetings discussion. But this is one of the things that he's really passionate about. Charles heads up the open records, open meetings function for our General Counsel's office, and he has studied a lot in this area, and this is something that's passionate, and you can tell that he loves and lives and breathes it, and make sure that Bill and I stay away from that line when we're having stuff too, though. Okay. Good job, Charles. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Very good. All right, Charles, thank you very much. We'll go to our next agenda item, item D, approval of the minutes. I guess I also like to say I want to thank the staff, for myself, and I'm sure all board members, for being able to get all these packets out to us now in a timely manner. I believe all of the board members probably got their whole packet last week, so it's really helpful that we get it out that much in advance. We have a chance to review it, so I just want to thank staff very much for getting that out. So the meeting minutes, again, so with that, everybody was given a summary of the minutes. Has anybody reviewed them? I'm sure everybody's reviewed them. Is there any comments?
No, sir.
Okay.
I got one little comment.
Yep.
Minutes are from,
And who are you?
this is Scott Anderson, minutes from 2013. To the best of my recollection, I mean, when we're going back a year and a half, that's just a long time for me to be able, but to the best of my recollection, this is what happened.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Duly noted, Mr. Anderson.
Okay, so do we have a motion to accept the minutes?
A motion to accept the minutes.
Who are you?
John McGraw.
And do we have a second?
This is Nancy Crumley, I second it.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
And all opposed? And it so passes. Yeah, again, like Charles said, I think a lot of us have been here a while, we know who we are, but I think we have a lot of new staff members.
yeah.
So I think we'll take, and we haven't met in 2 years, so it'll take a little while, and Tamla's by. Yeah, so it'll take a little while for the staff, I think, to get familiar with us. So, like Charles said, I think we need to be mindful of that and remember to announce ourselves. I will violate that 100 times today, but let's endeavor. Okay, so we'll move to agenda item E, TDLR video presentation on public comment process.
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe that we have anyone signed up for public comment. This is a video that my boss, Bill Coons, had created. It stars our very own Mary Winston in it, and it's to help folks kind of guide them through the process of the public comment portion. But since we don't have it, I don't think it's necessarily to go through it. It's on our webpage where the public can see it. We also include the information, links to it on our agendas as well that go out for the commission meetings.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
So item F on the agenda was public comment, but like staff had mentioned, that there's nobody here to pick up or to talk about public comment. So we'll move on to item G. The chair will recognize staff reports from the executive office.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Francis, Deputy Executive Director with TDLR. Thank you again for being here. Wish you guys the best in the holidays with the family and all that good stuff. But we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to work with us today. We've got a few items on the agenda that's going to need your attention, whether it's the penalty matrices or whether it's the rules, so we appreciate you being here. I'll just give a quick update on what's going on with TDLR. We had an incredible legislative session. Incredible can be filled in by different words, but it was busy. It was extremely busy. We had new folks that we had to deal with and work with. We had new members on the Senate side with the new lieutenant governor. We had a new governor's office. We had a lot more members that didn't know who TDLR was. And so we spent a lot of time helping them understand the role that we play. It's very difficult for people to wrap their mind around, well, how do you do 25 programs? And how are you going to do 32? And how are you going to do 38? They just really don't understand how that works. And so we're talking a lot about the agency and its functional alignment and our business model and how we hire the experts and smart people that allow us to be successful in doing these things. To that end, sometimes those good deeds get punished or rewarded. So Senate Bill 202 passed, and it will move seven new programs from the Department of State Health Services to TDLR, and we'll probably take those on maybe in September or August of this year. We've already been working to build the infrastructure for them. And then the next biennium, we're going to get 6 more. So we're going to be the home of midwives and dyslexia therapists and dietitians and hearing fitters and dispensers and speech pathologists and audiologists, athletic trainers, and I'm missing one. Massage therapists, which will be in the second phase. So we've got a lot of stuff on our plate. We ended up having 10 advisory board meetings in the month of November. It was incredible. And one commission meeting. It felt like 11. It was that long. The first advisory board meeting we had with the orthotists and prosthetists, which was the other group, lasted 11 hours. They were a standalone group. They were a little concerned and hesitant about being an advisory board, and so we had to go through that dance that you have, and 11 hours later, we won them over. As part of that process of bringing on and knowing that we're going to take on these new boards at some point, we've done some reorganization in our agency. Delia is one of the folks from the reorganization, so Tamla, Delia, and Mary Winston, who's an attorney from our enforcement division, now part of our Office of Strategic Communications. We stole her from Christina. Didn't even ask. We just snuck in and just snatched her out. It's very still a little sensitive about that. But so that team is there to provide support to the advisory boards. We'll be at 25 advisory boards by the time this thing gets to September. In 2 years, we'll be at 31 advisory boards. So it is our new core competency in addition to licensing, doing the regulation, doing the inspections. And that's your comment about the getting the information out. That means a lot. Delia and them have been working hard to build some standard operating procedures to make sure that we provide that level of support that the advisory boards deserve and need. So that's been a big deal, big change for us. Kim is going to touch a little bit on some of the changes that we've made in our education and examination division as a result of taking on these new programs. On September 1, we did take on the driver training and driver safety program. So that is part of TDLR's fold. So we're doing the course curriculums. None of you have never had to do the defensive driving courses. I know that you don't need that, but some others have. Bill has been a pilot test on a lot of those courses to make sure that they're done properly. So we've got that new responsibility, and it's really been eye-opening. We try to look at taking on the new programs, one, as an honor, that they're looking at our agency as a place that these things can be done well. We also try to learn from it. I don't know if any of you guys are Star Trek folks, but we take a Borg approach to life, that we'll grab them, we'll consume them, but we'll take the best of what they have and try to make TDLR better. So our existing programs get the benefit of the best of the new ones that are coming over, and they get the best of what we've already had in place, and our staff grows from learning from these new programs. So it's been a lot of work. I miss you, Lawrence. Jim's doing a great job. I just miss you. It's good seeing your face up there. That just popped in my head as I looked at you on that side of the table, not over here. TDLR is growing, and that's a rare statement to make in state government today. There's a lot of contraction in terms of programs, in terms of resources, and so we're in a very fortunate position, and we're going to continue to earn that honor of being in that spot by being smart. Talking about the resources, we are technically waiting for the money for the new programs. Haven't kind of given that to us yet. So all the work that we're doing for the infrastructure has been done for free, but we know it's going to pay off because it's only smart to build the house before you move in. And we want to make sure that we have this thing in order and properly set up before we take on these new responsibilities at the agency. The last thing I will mention is in regard to the rules that we'll take up today for the elevator program. That came out of the legislative session. The work and opportunity that you guys are going to do today, finalizing those rules or at least making recommendations to our commission, they will take it up for final discussion and vote at their January 6th meeting. And then those rules will be moved and put into effect. That's just going to be another opportunity to touch on what Charles talked about, which is the transparency. That's going to be another opportunity for the public to weigh in and have comments about the rules if they feel like there's something that needs to be addressed in there. It is not, but I feel like you guys are going to do a great job of vetting that issue today, and the commission will be able to take it up in earnest. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have, unless you have any questions.
Okay, I do not. Any board members, any questions?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, Brian.
By the way, we just have 3 more advisory board meetings this week, just, that's what we do now. Second job.
All right, very good, thank you.
Yes, sir.
We'll move on to item G2, Compliance Division Staff Report.
Good afternoon. My name is David Gonzalez. I am the Regulatory Programs Manager here in the Compliance Division. There's actually a couple of us. I oversee 7 programs. This is just a reminder. I know it's been a while since we've seen each other. I have responsibilities for 7 programs: architectural barriers, elevators is included, bar cause, so it's a vast array of different kinds of programs. And I don't have as many as these guys do, so I entrust a lot of the responsibilities to the staff, the Compliance Division staff that take care of our daily business. So what I'm here today is to take care of number 2A, which is personnel changes. I haven't had the opportunity to formally introduce in front of you guys somebody that I think was introduced to y'all as our deputy inspector. Mr. Jim Mernan is now our chief for the state of Texas, and he's been that way for some time. He had some shoes to fill. Deference to Mr. Taylor, who did a wonderful job for us. Mr. Jim has come in and really gangbusters. I want to acknowledge in front of my bosses, in front of you guys, and in front of everybody listening at home that he has taken on a lot of responsibility in a short period of time, came on as a deputy inspector with us, and had to learn a whole bunch in a little bit of time, deal with some legislative changes to processes and how we deal with licensing, with enforcement, and has done a bang-up job for us. So great kudos to our chief, Mr. Jim Mernan, and I just wanted everybody to hear that. Also, I'm very pleased because it is so hard to find these experienced gentlemen. We stole him from Dallas He had years of experience in the industry, but he had a helper a long while back ago, who was apparently interested in coming back to work for the state. I don't know why, but we convinced him to join us. Mr. Jared Bledsoe, also from the Dallas area, has joined us as our deputy chief here at TDLR. So very excited to have these gentlemen on board. He's only been here a few months, so we haven't scared him away yet. Hopefully he'll make that probationary period and want to stay on longer. But we've got a lot of work for them. Now, in addition to them, we've got Keitha Chester and Shirley Rogers, who hopefully are listening upstairs. They're our administrative support in the compliance section. And, of course, I couldn't do any of my work without the support of my administrative staff, Ms. Beth Clare, who really helps out a lot. So I wanted to let y'all know that there are lots of cogs and other people behind the scenes helping with this, in addition to all the other divisions that we rely on for support. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our Chief Elevator Inspector, Mr. Jim Renan.
Thank you, David.
Chief, I didn't recognize you. You look so sharp.
Yeah, they only fit. Good afternoon, advisory board members and everyone else in attendance. I'm Jim Renan. I'm the Chief Elevator Inspector, and this is the first time that I'm coming in front of you all. It does feel different, Brian, looking at my old boss sitting across. I've got to say that.
I'm waiting for him to tell me I'm out of order. You're out of order, Francis.
We, as David said earlier, there's been a lot of changes to the elevator program with the help of all the other divisions. The first thing that has happened in 2015, we've brought on about 10 new licensed inspectors. That includes an orientation period where myself or the deputy works with these new inspectors going over the statute and rules and get them acclimated to those things. And then they, of course, receive their state license, and now they're out in the field. So, and that manpower is going to help greatly, because at the present, we have about 167 state inspectors throughout the state, and we could probably use about 50 more if necessary. One thing that exec did for us is give me a direct line to enforcement. So I've filed numerous cases, not frivolous ones, but just numerous ones on elevators that, is that not on? Okay. On elevators that are out of compliance. The big thing that executive did is with the mandation of elevators with no door restrictors or non-operable door restrictors, and elevators that do not have fully functional phase 1 fire service. That goes to an immediate shutdown order. In most of the cases, we get full compliance from the owners, and they agree to shut down the elevators. There have been a few cases where we've had to go through general counsel or through the attorneys in enforcement and force them to shut them down. But for the most part, the owners are cooperating with that. Been out on numerous job sites. That includes San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, and most of the time that's either I'm trying to help the general contractors, the elevator contractors, architects, or the inspectors on an issue that comes out on the job site. And the last thing as far as current projects was what we're going to be discussing later is the new category of the removed from service. I think is going to greatly help the owners and make it easier. The compliance department has been inundated since I've arrived here at TDLR with owners seeking help because either the economy's in a depressed state or their building is in a depressed state. As far West Texas is a good example where the economy's not doing too good. The owners call, the building has no power, the building's been vandalized, and they want to get the state off their backs because they're getting the computer-generated letters that they missed their annual inspection. So I think this removal from service is going to greatly help them in that function. The next thing on the agenda is the speaking engagements. And last February, I met with the inspectors in both San Antonio and Dallas. That was at their CE classes. That helps greatly. What I'd like to do is expand on that now that we have a deputy and set up voluntary meetings with the inspectors in all the major cities in Texas. Because that just shows that we're behind them as far as supporting them in their decisions. And it also conveys what direction we want them to take. So that's the direction I'd like to go in that. In June, I did a presentation on elevator equipment for various types of buildings for the West Texas Architects and Engineers Association in Lubbock, Texas. Can't remember the name of the building I did it in. It was a dance hall out in Lubbock. But it was nice. It was a dinner luncheon deal. There was about 15 architects in attendance, and that went over real well. October 30th, we just did a presentation, myself and my deputy, with the Plano Fire Department, and that was also on the different types of elevator equipment and on safe passenger extrication. This coming February, I'll be meeting with the inspectors again in San Antonio and Dallas at the CE classes. And last week, myself and our deputy, did a presentation for DADS, which is your Texas Department of Aging and Disability. There was about 45 to 50 of those inspectors present. And those are the inspectors that do all the nursing homes and assisted living facilities because they have a separate inspection on their elevators. On to plan reviews. Plan reviews until TDLR hired our deputy chief probably took up a great amount of my time. Thank God now that he's on board, it frees me up for other things. But the plan reviews have increased greatly. As you can see from the graph, new installations for the fiscal 2015 years totaled 1,010. Alteration plan reviews was 510, with a grand total of 1,520 plan reviews for the year 2015. I apologize for the next graph, which only shows September and October, but we prepared this for last month's meeting, and November, roughly about the same as October. New installations was 216, alterations was 65, giving us a total of 281.
Excuse me, Brian Morris, Jim, I have a
Yeah.
question. So as far as the time frame of getting the plan reviews, have we always been on track with that?
As far as your turnaround time,
Yeah.
are you? Yes.
Okay. Well, good. I'm glad to hear that, because I know when we set that up 2, 3, 4 years ago, we had Superman that was reviewing the plans, and we were wondering how the time period would be if we ever lost Superman, and we did. So I'm just again, so I'm glad to hear that we are on board with that, because I know that, remember in the board meetings that was a lot of discussion about the time frame and do we have enough staff, can they be done? So
And
good.
it helps when Superman trains you.
Okay, so I'm glad to hear that, for the public, that the plan review process is on track.
That's working fine. In fact, I'll report further on down because we've been working with the contractors to try to streamline that process.
Okay.
The next graph shows the 2015 waivers and delays. So we had a total of 45 waivers and 107 delays, which gave us a total of 152. Most of those delays will, once we get the new process of removed from service, I would look to see about 50% of those delays to go away, because that's what the owners are requesting. And then for September, October, we had a total of 7 delays, no waivers. Reported incidents. And notice we use the word incidents, and that's, most of these are on escalators. And most of them are only incidents, not accidents. What happens is we receive the reports from the buildings. A lot of them tend to be malls throughout Texas on escalators. And once the agency or myself can determine that the incident happened through human error, then we can close it out. If it truly is an equipment malfunction, the equipment is rendered inoperative until the agency gives the owner the okay to put it back in service. Brian, you know, we had one in El Paso 2 weeks ago. That unit just went back on Friday after a full inspection was done. And that was human error from what we're being told, but bad human error. I'll leave it at that.
Jim,
Yes.
question, Grayson Gill, so there are no deaths at all reported in the period?
Not in 2015, no, sir.
Okay.
So the incidents, most of them don't even have to be reported to TDLR. But like most owners, they'd rather be safe than sorry. So anything that happens on their equipment, they usually fill out the report and send it in to us.
Jim?
Yes.
Scott Anderson.
Yes.
You're going to hear from me. This is my favorite part.
Uh-huh.
Jim, I've always asked, I know it says incidents, if there's a way we could break this out, because it's a large number, and if when we do this, if you could just list what are actual accidents built into this, where it is equipment. I mean, maybe if it's, if we're into a cone plate problem, if we're into side step, I'm sure the majority of these are falls.
Well, and if you, Scott, we've already done that. If you notice on the graph at the bottom for 2015, it shows incidences for elevators and incidences for escalators. There are no accidents. Every one of the ones we received in 2015 was an incident where
Was an
somebody.
incident, so there were no accidents on elevators or escalators?
No, sir.
Okay.
Yep. That would have been a separate graph if we would have been provided with any information or reported an accident.
Okay. Thank you.
2016 is for your month of September, October, and you had 1 on an elevator and 13 on an escalator. I supplied you all with an addendum. You should have had it in front of you on the new technology variances, because on the graph, that's a typo. And there were actually, should be, let me get to my last page here. It's listing 2, it should actually be 3. Those on there, you'll have 5 listed on the addendum that I supplied you with, but 2 of them are not formally approved. The last one, 15-05, excuse me, 15-02, excuse me, that's the Thyssen Twin system. That is still under review. That's their brand-new elevator system. It's 2 elevators running in the same hoistway independently. So you have 1 hoistway, 1 elevator can be going up, 1 can be going down. So we're looking at that one very closely. The 4th one, NTV 1504, has been approved, but Schindler has not received their approval letter yet. That's the only thing we're waiting on that. And 1501, the AdRail escalator, that was the first one we did in 2015, and just so the board knows, it's one that I was pretty happy to see get passed. It took our committee a lot of convincing on my part, because I was against it at first. The code that Texas is currently under, A17.1, 2007, in my interpretation, specifically says that you cannot do any type of advertising on escalators. This is a company that goes out, puts an advertisement that adheres to the handrails on escalators. So you're going to start seeing these throughout the state. What the committee did was incorporate safety verbiage every 3 feet in that advertisement. In other words, attend to your children, please hold the handrail, please be aware of obstacles. Myself and our deputy, Jared, we just went down to San Antonio last month. That was the first one done, other than they did a couple in Houston, which is not our jurisdiction, and viewed it. And I really liked what I saw. We're hoping that it's going to increase the awareness on the escalators, because like we just discussed, most of the things that happen on escalators are incidences, and it's from people not paying attention. 99% of every incident on an escalator is somebody trips because they're not watching what they're doing. So hopefully this will be something new. I just know myself, when I get on an escalator, I'll go into daydream mode right away. You know, I'm thinking about business and stuff. I'm not worried about holding the handrail or paying attention. And that's what people have to do to stop from falling on an escalator, because when you fall, you're going to get hurt.
Jim, John McGraw.
Yes.
You don't think there's a real risk of people paying so much attention to the message on the handrail that they're not watching the end of the escalator coming up?
And this is where we went with the variance committee, because my initial interpretation was the code says the reason for not having any advertisements on an escalator is because you do not want to distract the riding public. Well, that's what an advertisement does, is distract you.
And even safety messages do.
Correct. Exactly. So, and that's the good thing about where we're at with being in the 2000 code. Anything above and beyond that, they have to apply for a variance, so the state gets to approve it or disapprove it. We're monitoring this very closely, and if we see a rise in incidences on the escalator, then we can revoke the variance. But you know, we're trying to do something to improve that, and hopefully this is going in that direction, but time will tell.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Francis, in reviewing this, we looked at other states, what they were doing, looked at some of the provisions they were putting in there before granting the variance. We also looked at some of the statistics that they were able to do in other states to show the incident rate of when they had graphics on the handrail and when they did not. And we saw that the numbers were, it was negligible.
No change.
There was no difference in that. So we were very concerned about that. Jim, he's tough. He's tough on these issues, and he comes into the meetings with the ability and the authority to talk directly to Bill and I, even when we were thinking we're absolutely right. So some vigorous discussions, and it didn't happen in 2 days. It took a while for us to get some comfort with that, and I think Jim did a great job of walking through there. But when he gets comfortable with it, we can get there as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Hey, Jim, this
Yes.
is Lawrence Taylor. When they do these handrail advertising things, are they required to do a plan review so that you know that that's going on and you've got an idea where it is and how many and that kind of thing?
Yes, sir, Lawrence, that is exactly right. A plan review is submitted on every installation, and then the longest it stays on there is 8 weeks at the tops. But most of them, you're talking about a 3 to 5 day turnaround on the advertisements, because they're promotional.
Oh, okay.
The one we went down to at the convention center in San Antonio, what, Jared, 3 days?
Yes, sir.
Was going to be on there for 3 days. And do you remember what the ad was?
It was a medication.
Yep. Yeah, it was actually a medical advertisement for an inhalation device for like asthmatics or something. And we went down there. I mean, Jared jumped right on it. We saw a group of young ladies riding the escalator, so he followed them on up, and he said, "Hey, did you all notice the graphics?" And they said no. I mean, they admitted right to him, no, we weren't even paying attention. And he says, well, you didn't see that safety sign in there? They said, we didn't even see the ad for this medicine. I mean, they just weren't paying attention. But something's got to be done to spark people's interest because, you know, escalators and children, for one, don't mix, period. All my years in the field, and Lawrence can probably back me up. I mean, I'd be having lunch in a mall, and I see a parent with 2 little kids, and they're not holding their hands, and it makes me cringe. Because those are machines. They don't have any feelings. If a foot gets stuck, it's not going to stop right away, you know? So if we can increase the public's awareness of what they're doing by 1%, I think we're going to be heading in the right direction. Like I said, if it happens to show more incidents that happen, we'll revoke the variance and be back at square one. But we got to try something to take this in the right direction.
Jim, Brian Morris, I have a question.
Yes.
So does every ad require the plan review, or the plan review is a blanket?
Every
License.
installation requires. So if,
Okay.
once he pulls that one off, that is over. If he wants to go back next week to do the exact same thing, exact same ad, he has to do another plan review.
And in the plan review, does it indicate how long they intend it to be on there?
Yes.
Okay.
And he even supplies us the font, what message we want, what safety message we want to use. If we want to vary it every 3 feet, we get that choice. So, yes, and all the NTVs are on our website.
But yeah, of course.
So if you want to look it up, and any specific terms will be spelled out on that approval letter, which is on the website.
And Mr. Chairman, just looking at the new technology variance for this particular one, number 6 says that the company in question will report any and all accidents occurring on an escalator where AdRail graphics films was installed, and then it goes through their reporting requirements they have to do specifically for those installations. So we are going to get some granular information on those devices and those installations.
Okay.
Okay. And I think that concludes, no, I have one more thing. I'm sorry. Got to cut me some slack first time. The last thing, and it talks about recent developments. What I am striving for, as long as I'm employed here, is I want to see more things happen through our division automatically. In other words, computer generated. Because as you've heard Brian say, you know, the government in the state of Texas expects us to do more with less. So for that to happen, we have to go that way. But I don't want to see it happen through penalization of the building owners. I want to see it happen through educating the building owners. Because right now, there seems to be a lot of building owners out there who do not take an active interest in their elevators. And it's really easy because that's the system we've had set up for years. I mean, the experts are the elevator companies, and it's real easy for a building owner to just hire ABC Elevator Company and say, handle it, and let me know that everything's okay. Well, they can't do that anymore because as of the way our statute's written, everything is geared on the responsibility of the owner, so they have to take an active interest in it. And they've got to get educated about these elevators. That ensures two things. It ensures their peace of mind knowing that their equipment is safe, and it also ensures them that they're getting the best bang for their buck through their elevator maintenance contractor. So with that is my report. Nancy?
Hi, Jim.
Hi.
Back to your, well, he said, hi, Nancy. That was good enough.
I should have said Nancy Crumley so they
Thank
could pick it up.
You just did, Brian Francis.
Your slide about training. Either I didn't know or I didn't realize the department was doing training for fire departments and people who wanted rescue?
At their request, now when I say that, when we say we do training on extrication, that's very limited because of the legal responsibility.
Correct.
So, to give you an instance, when myself and Jared went to Plano, we showed them how Phase 1, Phase 2 operates, where the door restrictor is. But as far as getting anyone out, they are to contact the licensed elevator contractor for that equipment for the building and let them put on a seminar, because we're not going to get into training someone on extrication, because the fire departments have their own way of doing things. And a lot of it doesn't go along well with elevator companies, because jaws and elevators don't mix too well, so. So we don't get into very specifics. It's mostly, like I said, Phase 1, Phase 2, and just letting them look at the equipment to know what they're dealing with. We actually let them look at the car top, the hoistway equipment, the machine room, and the pit equipment, just so that they know what is there if they have to get into those areas, and that's as far as we go.
It's more orientation,
Correct.
right?
Yep.
Grayson Gill, I've got one comment to add to that. Ron Steele and I did a lot of that similar training years ago for Dallas, and one of the biggest challenges is we were putting door restrictors on. We weren't telling firefighters they were putting door restrictors on. So the biggest issue was, hey, we've been getting people out of this elevator for years, now the doors won't open. So we failed to go tell them that we've installed door restrictors on. So that was part of the training at that time to really get the word out. And what was very helpful was the elevator companies like yours allowing us to use a set of mock-up doors for training at the fire department training areas. That was very helpful as well.
I don't know if you caught it, there was an article in the paper today, very short, about a Chicago firefighter who lost his life
No, I did
this
not.
week. Fell down a hoistway, 2 floors, if I'm remembering the article. Smoke, he was looking for a source of smoke.
So he unlocked the hoistway doors and fell in?
It was a very short article, I don't know anything more, but I just thought
Not
I'd bring
good.
that up, no.
That's, our main goal is just to point out to them where the dangers are and what they have to look for. Give you a good example of that on a traction elevator. If somebody was pinned between the car sill and the hoistway sill, do they want to take the jaws and try to raise that up, because now you're going to put slack in the cables? So that's stuff they need to think about. They have to look at how they're going to attack those situations. We don't show them how, we just try to point out stuff they need to keep on their mind, because you're dealing with machinery. So,
Thank you.
yep.
Thank you. All right, any other questions from the board?
I think George has something.
Wait, excuse me, Lawrence has a question.
Hey, Jim, this is Lawrence Taylor again. I wanted to go back to the ad rail thing and what I heard Brian say, that they're supposed to report all accidents.
Yes.
Yeah, accidents is a pretty serious event. What are the requirements about incidents? Somebody trips and falls.
Yeah, and the discussion, trying to think of the man's name, Gianni Cortetta, is the man that owns that company, and that's who we deal with one-on-one. He, it might not be spelled out in the NTV, but he will report any and all, everything is the handshake that I have with him, or he has sworn to me he will report any incident at all.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Francis. Mr. Taylor, that's a great question. When we were going through and looking at the data for where they've had previous installations, we discovered that they were doing several studies and research to show that their product was working. So we also had a provision in there to say, provide us with every study, research, project that you do related to Texas installations, because they're going to use Texas to sell to the next state. And they're going to use Texas to sell to the next state. So we're also going to get access to that information that they are gathering on their own to try to make their case and sell their product. So,
Scott, who's actually going to do the reporting? Is it the advertiser, or is it the building owner?
Legally, we should get it from both.
you're going to get it from both.
Okay,
You're going to get it from both.
because one of them's a little self-serving.
Right, exactly. And the statute says.
Both of them can be. in
Yeah,
some
both of
cases.
them can be
In some
self-serving,
cases,
so-
but we're gonna get it from both, and one with the timing increment of how quickly it has to be here, so.
Correct.
Well, I know you're monitoring it, but like I said, it's maybe a case of you got a couple of foxes watching that house instead of just one.
Correct, correct.
Okay, no more questions? All right, Jim, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members, I'm George Ferry, Director of the Compliance Division. Had one thing to add to the compliance report. We have a couple of, in case any of you are looking to come to work for TDLR, we have a posting on our website for 2 positions. They're basically a couple positions that we were given by the legislature in the last session to help out with the elevator program. They will also provide assistance probably to our industrialized housing and building program and our architectural barriers program. But looking for someone who has a lot of knowledge of construction and obviously of elevators too. These individuals will be used to help out if we get covered up with plan reviews and need some help in elevator, or to provide relief so that Jim and Jared could actually go out more and visit job sites, visit inspectors, visit fire departments. So that position is posted on our website and actually closes tomorrow at 5 o'clock. So if you know anyone, or if anyone listening at home is interested in coming to work for the Department of Licensing Regulation, we have opportunities, and we'd love to see your application. So just wanted to put in a plug for that, because we're hoping that's going to provide us with a lot of assistance. And that's all I have.
Very good.
All right.
George?
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Good job. Chair will move to item G3, staff report for Education and Examination Division.
Good afternoon, members. I'm Kim Witt with the Education and Examination Division. And as Brian stated, we've had some big changes in our division. We've grown to 3 sections. We have a school inspection site visit section, and they were created for the purpose to streamline inspection processes for the cosmetology and barber schools, as well as any other schools or education providers that we may acquire with the new programs coming to us. And your CE providers will fall under this as well. Eventually, they want to get out and start sitting through the courses and kind of monitoring what's going on. The inspectors in this section came to us, because we stole them, from the Field Operations Division. So, and then
I hear a theme.
we love to steal. And along with the inspections of the schools, they're going to be creating a site visit process which will be able to assist education providers with best practices and to help them with technical assistance to ensure proper compliance. We have a driver education safety section, which includes the Parent Talk program from DPS and the driver education program that was at Region 13's Education Service Center. And with this section, they'll be reviewing all the education, driver education programs and safety programs, as well as approving the schools. Next would be your Education and School Services Accreditation and Certification section, which is mine. We're responsible for the review and approval of all the education providers and courses for the 12 programs, as well as the oversight of exams, which is 11 programs. We also process all the new barber school and cosmetology school applications, and we request the inspections through the inspection section. We'll also be taking on new programs from the Department of State Health Services, and these programs also have exam and continuing education components. So we've grown to 13 people from about 5 or 6, so it's exciting. We're all learning each other and everything. So as far as your CE numbers, nothing much has changed since the last meeting. And that's all I have today. If y'all have any questions.
Okay. Any questions from the board?
No, sir.
I have one question. Is everybody doing their CE requirement online individually for the most part?
It varies, yes. We have an online process, and then some of them are actually doing classroom. so we don't
Related
really
to
get a
elevator, though?
report. Excuse me?
Sorry to interrupt.
That's
Related
okay.
to elevator specifically? Okay.
Mhm, mhm. Yes, All-Star, the provider All-Star training is all online classes. So, and then we have a few with the classroom.
Okay,
Is that it?
all right. Kim, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Next item on the agenda is the staff report, Enforcement Division.
Good afternoon, board members. My name is John Melleck, and I'm a prosecutor with the Enforcement Division. I'd like to start the report out in a little bit of a different order. Start with the statistics, the recent statistics over the last 2 fiscal years, then hitting the highlighted cases, and then following up with the question that we had with regarding the default process for the no inspection cases. Now, the report begins by saying these are key statistics from if you look at it, it says the electrician program, but it's actually a typo. These are, and I verified, these are the numbers from the elevator program. In fiscal year 15, we resolved more cases than we opened, 504 to 439. Means we're catching up on our caseload from the previous fiscal year where we opened 328 but only resolved 299 of those cases. This can be kind of attributed to the fact that we've dedicated more LAs or legal assistants and prosecutors to these no report or no inspection report generated cases. So it's helping us catch up on some of these backlog on some of these elevators that haven't been inspected in a while. With that, also our agreed orders have gone up by about 150% in the last fiscal year. Again, it's because these department report generated no inspection cases are being specifically tackled by a couple of our prosecutors on a daily basis. In the last fiscal year, which was 15, there was only a $20,000 difference between the total penalties assessed and which were collected. And if you look at this compared to the overall TDLR numbers, you can see that in this program specifically, they're much closer. And it's mainly because we have fewer defaults in the elevator program. Most of the time, we either get compliance and get a penalty assessed and collected, because that's kind of what the important issue with elevators is making sure it get compliance. And these elevators, building owners are helping us get that done. Turning to the highlighted cases, the 5 that we have listed here have all actually ended in agreed orders. And 4 of the 5, the first 4, all those penalties have been paid in full. The last one, they are on a payment plan. They're current on the payment plan, but it's the only one that still has an outstanding balance. First one, HEI Austin Hotel, was a complaint that came from the public. There were a total of 8 elevators in this hotel that were late getting their inspections. It also took over 3.5 months before the hotel filed their inspection reports with the department. And on these inspection reports, it indicated that violations from the previous year have failed to have been corrected. All totaled, an administrative penalty of $15,000 was assessed and paid to the department, and all the violations have been corrected.
John, Brian Morris, I have a question.
Yes.
So on that incident, did the hotel receive the automatic generated letters?
No, that one was because it came from the public. And maybe I should back up and kind of explain a little bit the way that enforcement works, because I think it's been a couple of years since this has gone on. We get complaints from several different sources. We can get them from the public, because when the public goes in the elevator, they can see the certificate of compliance in there. They can see what date, that compliance runs to, that year period. And obviously, if it says, December 15th of 2014 in the elevator, they know that it has been a year since that one's been inspected. So they can go online or call the department. We have an intake section that takes those calls. They can file a complaint. Those will go to one of our investigators in the enforcement section. A case will be opened up. Our investigators will contact the building owners, find out why the inspection hasn't taken place, or whatever. Sometimes, a lot of times, people might get stuck in an elevator, then they'll file a complaint that way. So we get complaints from the public. Jim and his staff will file complaints, as he talked about in his direct enforcement, and then we also have these no inspection report generated list that the department just generates on its own. So we have several different ways that we can open up a case. This one in particular came from a member of the public who, I guess, was riding in the elevator, saw that the inspection was out of date, and just filed a complaint with the department. So, and then after that happens, the prosecutors take a look at it, and then we either can, depending on what the evidence shows, issue a notice of alleged violation for whatever the violation may occur, either in late inspection, didn't correct previous deficiencies that were on a previous inspection, no firefighter service, whatever that might be. Hopefully get compliance. If we don't, sometimes these people might want a hearing, as is their right, and we'll go to the State Office of Administrative Hearing, have a hearing. Or if they do nothing, they don't answer us, we can't get in contact with them, that's when it goes to the default stage, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But in this case in particular, it was a member of the public that came to us with that. The second case, North Star Mall, was also a complaint that came from the public, where there were a total of 12 elevators that were late inspected. These were overdue by about 2 weeks, and then there were also 4 escalators that were approximately 4 months late in getting inspected. And that kind of goes back to the late equals unsafe. Even in our consideration is if the elevator is 1 day out of inspection, we consider it late and it's unsafe because, these, as Jim was talking about earlier, these are mechanical machines that have a potential to do some great damage to people. So even if you're 1 day late, it's equaled unsafe, and so therefore we pursue those cases. Again, like the previous case, there were deficiencies on the previous inspection that hadn't been corrected. And in this case, an administrative penalty of $9,375 was assessed and also paid by the respondent. The next two are those report-generated cases. First one, Valley Baptist Realty Company, was a complaint, like I said, generated from that no inspection list. There were 12 elevators that were a year late in getting their inspection. They were assessed an administrative penalty of $10,250, and they paid that, and now they're current with their inspections. Gulf Crest Country Club was also off that list, and the respondent had 1 elevator that had not been inspected in 3 years. The report says they were assessed a $15,000 penalty, but that was a typo. It was actually only $1,500. They have paid that, and they are also current with their inspections. Finally, one of the last cases we'll highlight is Elevator Texas Inc. Of Texas Inc. This case was opened by our chief elevator inspector at the time, Mr. Taylor, due to an accident that happened in July 2013 in Pasadena, Texas. In the case, the elevator apparently fell 1 floor and injured 2 people. The violations that were found were that the elevator contractor installed the elevator incorrectly, which resulted in 11 ASME code violations. The respondent admitted to all these violations and subsequently fixed them. An agreed order was assessed for $9,000. And this is the one I spoke of that is currently on a payment plan, and they still have about 8 months left on that payment plan to pay off that $9,000. And then finally, we'll touch on those procedures with regard to the defaults for these no inspection cases. It's included in the report, but as you can see, the vast majority of the cases that we have do not end with a default. But in the instances that we do have a default, typically what happens is a notice of violation has been sent out to the building owner, and we've just either either the mail has come back as unclaimed, no forwarding address, or it was delivered but the building owner just has not contacted us back. So typically what we do is at that point, our legal assistant will send a notice of default letter. It basically gives them one more opportunity. It's like, look, you're about to go into default. If you want to talk about this case, here's your one last chance. And after a little bit of passage of time, usually about 30 days, if we get no contact from the building owner at that point, typically in our normal cases, what we do is that we then draft a default order, which our executive director, Bill, will sign off on, and that's kind of it. In these elevator cases, because we know compliance is key, what we do is when we get to that point, once we get that notice of default letter back or haven't got a word back from them, what we do at that point is we go back to the investigator and we put it on a fast track investigation. We say, contact the building owner, try to make sure we've got the correct building owner, because sometimes these buildings do change hands and they sell, and we may not have the correct owner, and the previous owner may have been getting all the mail, but they don't care because they don't own the building anymore. So we go back to the investigator, we say, make sure that we have the correct building owner, that the building is still there, because sometimes the building has been demolished, and make sure that we've crossed all of our T's and dotted our I's. Once that comes back and we find out that the building owner is who it is and that we've sent the letters to the right place, the investigator tries to get one last time to try to get compliance, try to get that elevator inspection scheduled, happening. And if we can get that to happen, then we either just will default the case, which means that you still have the violation and you still failed to respond to all our stuff, but the elevator's in compliance, now you just owe this penalty, or we can close the case. In the rare instances that that we can't get a hold of the building owner anymore, and just no communications, that's when we will take it a step further. We'll go forth with the default order, and then we'll also go forth with one of the emergency shutdown orders to take some kind of legal action on our front to physically be able to go into the property to have the elevator shut down to make sure that it is not being used. So that's kind of what we do when we get to that default stage for an elevator. Like I said, typically the other cases that we have in different programs, once we get to the default, we just get the default order signed, and then we kind of move on. And we try to collect the penalty, through other means. But in these cases, we want to make sure that either we can get the elevator inspected and make sure that it's in compliance, or if we can't get in contact with anybody, we'll take that extra step and make sure that we, physically will go in there and get an emergency shutdown order so where we can go by and actually have that elevator shut down. So, and that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, this is Lawrence Taylor. In that last instance where you were discussing, you sent the letters, you determine you got the right owner, they're just ignoring you, you take that action and get a default order with a penalty of some amount. Is there a mechanism by which a lien can be placed on so that person can't sell that property without us collecting our money and without the next owner knowing the history of what happened as a result of it?
No.
Yeah.
There's not the ability for us to place that lien on it. The lien can, no, it's not even a lien. The judgment against them in a default order process that they've not paid, Lawrence, that can continue on that person, but it would not attach to that property.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This is Nancy Crumley. I have one question. How many cases of shutdown were there in the last 12 months? Actual
Last
shutdown?
12 months, I don't think we've had to take that action, these shutdown orders.
Jim, do you have any recollection? Go to the table so the microphone can catch your dulcet tones.
Yes, Jim Renan, Chief Elevator Inspector. The way that we do the door restrictors and Phase 1 fire service cases they're expedited cases. It's a separate complaint form that's filled out, so that goes to the top of the list. So shutdown is always a possibility, and the attorney or the investigator can surely use that as leverage, but I believe John's correct that we haven't gotten to that point over the last year. All the owners have corresponded with the correct documentation. What we usually do is ask them for a signed contract with an elevator contractor in the cases like fire service or the door restrictors to show that it's either going to be corrected or added to the elevator, and that way the attorney can have an end date in sight. And as long as we know that process is going forward, we allow them to still utilize their elevators. But if they come back with an answer, well, I haven't gotten a bid, or I don't know who I'm going to use, usually then, in the past, the attorneys have said, well, then you've got to get us something by such and such a date, or we're going to shut you down.
Mr. Chairman, if I may chime in, I think it's important for the discussion to highlight that the first step in the process that I think applies universally is that we don't want, when we hit elevator shutdown, that's the end result. Our starting point is compliance, so we work with the building owners to try to get them to enter into a voluntary shutdown. And so I think it's important to distinguish between a voluntary shutdown and a mandatory shutdown where it's kind of a contested proceeding. We have not gotten to that point, but we have gotten to the point, well, I'll take that back. In the past, we have done a few where there was a mandatory shutdown, and we end up in litigation about that shutdown. But the preferred approach is to get the facility, the building owner, to voluntarily shut the elevators down, which we have a lot of success in doing. And so that's our starting point.
And Mr. Chairman, Brian Francis, I'll just chime in as well. A lot of chiming going on over here. What we've discovered over the years is that the mandated emergency shutdown is not fast. The moment that we exercise that process, it becomes a legal issue, and it goes to the courts. So the thing that we wanted to be shut down and out of operation last week, the courts and it goes for the continuation and all this stuff, it's open for 4 or 5 months. And it was absolutely frustrating. I know Lawrence was here during one of those moments. And so what we've done, and the staff has done a fantastic job, is they've come up with other ways of moving quicker to get the elevator out of operation when it's not working and get in compliance moving quicker. We've had great cooperation from the owners because they don't want to have an elevator that's going to harm their tenants and that sort of thing. So it's been, this path has turned out to be swifter than the go for it, we're going to shut you down with the heavy-handed government approach. So I'm really excited to see the numbers. I didn't realize that we had that much of an increase. It's phenomenal.
Any more questions? All right, thank you very much.
John, great job.
The next staff report will be the licensing division. Item G5 on the notice or agenda.
That's great.
Good afternoon. I am Tarsha Red, licensing manager for the elevator program. As you'll see on the in the data and the report in front of you, there's been a little bit of change in the last couple of years, but not a lot since August 31st, which was our last meeting we were going to have. But one thing I want to note, there's usually a little confusion on the numbers because at the bottom, people tend to want to add those numbers up to get a total, and that's not what that represents. So if you notice total population, you notice at the bottom that that's just a snapshot of the total number of active licenses on the first day of the month. And then the number of active certificates at the time, at the end of the month when the report is run, that's the number you see in the middle, the total number of active certificates. So those numbers it's never going to give you a total for that column, but it's just giving you a snapshot of what we have for elevator equipment at the beginning of that month. Again, not a lot of activity, not a lot of changes rather, but lots of activity. As you can see, just from September 1 to October 31st, we had 6,891 certificates issued for passenger elevators, 270 pieces of new equipment, and if you look at the August 31st column, 1,500 pieces of new equipment for last fiscal year, which chimes in with what Jim was saying about the plan reviews that he's receiving. So he does the plan reviews, and then we get the inspection reports to issue the license for them. So lots of activity, and we're getting busier and busier every day, which is a good thing. People are being more compliant in sending in their reports. So it's a positive step for the elevator program. And that's all I have. Do we have any questions? Yes.
I appreciate how hard you worked on these numbers, but I would like to think that the advisory board would be interested in knowing exactly how many pieces of equipment are registered, and none of these figures here seem to tell us that.
The total population is the total number of active licenses on the first of the month.
And that's,
But it's always
that's
gonna
all
be-
the pieces of equipment.
Right. And so that's going to always be a snapshot. If we, and it'll always be before the day of the meeting because our reports come in, are submitted before then. So it's never a snapshot as of this very moment.
I personally understand and appreciate that, but I
Right.
think it would be valuable information for this advisory board to be able to see that there are 41,324 pieces of equipment. Of those, there are X number of passenger elevators, X number of escalators, because we can't extrapolate anything from that other than that snapshot. And it doesn't give us a good feel for telling us how many real pieces of equipment we have.
Well, what we're looking at here in the report, it gives you the number of certificates that we've issued. So as far as the active licenses, the pieces of equipment where people are in compliance, that's what you see in the body of that bottom report.
And I understand that, and I appreciate that. But we should be able to determine that there are 41,324 pieces of equipment here at any time that anybody would call up and somebody did an open records request and said, I want to know how many elevators there are in this state, how many escalators, how many moving walks as of noon today. This doesn't tell us that, and that's valuable information I think the board could use, because we need to know exactly how many pieces of equipment there are that we covered, and the certificates don't represent that.
And you're correct. It's just that when we submit our reports for the board, they come in about a month before the actual board meeting happens.
Well, then what I'm saying then is when you do that, you should at that point, just somebody, I think, I'd be interested in knowing, when you do that, a breakdown or another column or another, something that says, this number represents this right here, and this is where it came from. Because we've got no way to look at this and tell where this number came from.
Okay.
And we can definitely do that. I see the point you're making with the terminology in that last box. It says issued by type. It just needs to say snapshot, here's everything in the different categories, and it adds up to
If we have
41,000.
41,324
Here's how they
pieces of
spread out.
equipment, there should be X number of passenger elevators.
Yep.
Of that number, there should be X number of electric ones, X number of hydraulic ones. And then so many escalators, so many elevators, and this unknown, to me, should disappear because we don't have any, and we're not going to give them a certificate anyway. Why is that even there?
Very good. We'll get, the next time we meet in 2092, we'll have that information up to date for you. No, Ms. Taylor, we appreciate that. We'll get that.
Brian Morris, I have a question. So-
Yes.
So these are the certificates for the equipment that's licensed by TDLR.
Correct.
Houston, we don't cover, Houston has their own
That is correct.
agencies,
And
so.
Beaumont.
Pardon me?
Isn't it Beaumont too?
No, just Houston.
Just Houston.
Okay, so is that any information for the board, again, because Houston has their own approved program.
Right.
So they're not licensed by us. And any fees or anything that Houston collects, it goes to Houston?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay.
Self-contained. There's collaboration in terms of when we are reviewing a new technology variance. We have a lot of dialogue with the city of Houston because we know they're probably going to get the same variance. So there's a lot of sharing of information on there. When you see the new technology variance and it's granted, at the very end it says, hey, this only applies to every place in Texas except for Houston. You need to go there to achieve having this variance apply in that area. But there's already been a lot of communication between our chief and their chief.
Okay. Then I guess, again, for the general public, should that, and unless you're really on the board or you live this life, you don't really know that that's the situation. So is it worthwhile for the board to see again, an asterisk or addendum footnote that this excludes
The city of
City of
Houston?
Houston equipment?
Sure.
We'll add those elements to it.
Okay.
We'll add what Mr. Taylor said and then also that statement as well.
Okay.
This is Lawrence Taylor again. I'm pretty sure if you were to call down to Houston and
probably tell
ask
you.
them, which I have done in the past, they can tell you exactly how many elevators they've got and break it out in exactly the manner I described. And it's not secret. I'm sure they tell you if you ask them.
Sure.
If I may, Mr. Taylor, there was no intent to be non-transparent.
Okay. Any other comments? Questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll move to agenda item
Thank you,
8.
Darcy.
Discussion and possible recommendation regarding proposed new rules proposed by the legislature. Proposed changes add new identification rules that establish standards to remove equipment from service and make other minor clarifications.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Francis, as Charles is approaching the table, I just wanted to check with you and the other members to see if we need to take a break before we start into this body of work.
Okay, yes. All right, 10 minutes?
Yes, sir, that'll be great.
Okay, all right, so at this time, at 2:43, the Elevator Advisory Board will go to a 10-minute break.
Yo, Mr. Grayson, yo.
Legislation. So staff has provided the board with a, I guess a draft of proposed language. I assume that all the board members have got that and have reviewed it. Since I'm talking right now, I need help for two terminologies, two explanations again, because I'm kind of a layman on the board here. The differences between the out of service and the removed from service. And then that'll keep my mind straight, continuing forward what we're doing.
Okay.
So the out of service.
Okay, Jim Renan, Chief Elevator Inspector. Out of service is per the requirements of the code, which is the ASME.
Okay, what does it mean?
Okay. Out of service is technically geared towards an owner decommissioning his elevator because you are actually, you're removing parts from the elevator. On a traction elevator, which is cable driven, the elevator needs to be landed in the pit. The cables have to be physically removed from the site. The doors, all the hoistway doors have to be bolted shut, and the mainline disconnect wires need to be cut. On a hydraulic elevator, the elevator has, on the traction to counterweight has to be landed in the pit also.
Okay.
On a hydraulic, the elevator needs to be brought down into the pit area, landed on the springs, a section of the oil line removed from site, all the oil drained, the doors bolted shut, and the mainline disconnect wires cut.
Okay. I guess where I was headed with that question a little bit was, that terminology means everything to most of the people in this room. But most of the people that this law and administrative rules apply to, like building owners, they're not gonna know what that means. On that one versus the removed from service. So what I suggest or recommend is some sentence or two layman language on really what that means. The intent, out of service, you're intended to not necessarily permanently shut down, but pretty much take out of service, and it's, or, not necessarily as an abandoning in place, but it's a severe act.
And it's very costly to the owners.
Yeah.
It's not a cheap endeavor. So if the owner has any inclination, say for instance, he's got to modernize the building in the next 3 years, out of service per code would not be the direction he would want to go.
Okay.
He would want to go with this new category, removed from service.
Because I went back and looked at all the other definitions, and they're kind of, they're pretty much, a layman can understand what that means. But then I get to these two, this one, and then the removed from service.
And Brian, you know where it gets real confusing is, I'll tell you, when you say the words out of service here at the agency, we're specifically speaking of out of service per code.
Mm-hmm.
When you go out in the world and you're talking to an elevator mechanic, out of service can simply mean just turning the elevator off. Same thing to a building owner.
Well, and again, as a general public, I'm used to seeing the out of service when you walk up to an elevator and they're doing something. It has a little post-it or sticker that says out of service.
Correct.
So
Correct.
quite honestly, when I saw this, that's what I thought we were talking about. That
Right.
it's just out of service, the mechanics are working on it, I'm inconvenienced, I gotta exercise and walk the stairs or whatever.
And what I've gotten into the habit, because it was a hurdle for me when I first came here. So now, when I say out of service, I always say out of service per code.
Okay, so again, board, I don't know if I'm off base on that. Do we want to leave it to staff to come up with a sentence or two to formulate?
Grayson Gill, comment just from, removed from service from an owner's perspective is very rare, as you're saying. It's usually a reuse of the hoistway for something else, like running cables or things like that. So I hear what you're saying. You may need to look for more definition and clarity, but I just don't think it's something that is happens very frequently from an owner's perspective.
Well, no, I understand it doesn't happen, but when the owner gets this, or I put this in front of somebody and say, you have to comply with all this, and they're looking at the definitions, they're like, what's out of service per ASME, that means nothing to a layman.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Francis, maybe we could go down the path of doing exactly what you're doing, is ask the question and come up with the FAQ that says, what is the difference between out of service and removed from service?
Right.
Okay.
And I think in that forum, we'll have a better universal answer that can give the lay perspective on that, if that's something you'd be agreeable to.
Okay, that's.
We'll commit to do that, and I'm looking at my guys, we'll make sure we have people that speak normal talk involved in it too.
Yeah.
Okay.
The biggest hurdle we encounter in trying to give a shorthand look at what that definition really means is that once you give an example or once you kind of summarize it, anything left out becomes an issue for the administrator, for the contested case process. And so from a rule writing perspective, it's better not to inject issues into that definition.
Okay. All right, I'll accept that. So then 37, the removed from service, which is the new definition that we're here to basically incorporate within the document.
Yes, sir. And the reason you have two definitions there is that we recognize that there was similarity between removed from service and out of service, and we wanted to, in the rule, just delineate that out of service is not the same thing as removed from service. And so it may not be the best definition, but the objective was to try to differentiate between the two.
And one objective for the removed from service is to suspend the requirements for the annual inspections.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Correct.
And in Lawrence's in Jim's presentation, I'll just say the chief. In the chief's presentation, he kind of gave you a synopsis of the rationale for what we're trying to accomplish, which goes along the lines of removed from service is less expensive, it's the least intrusive approach, which is why the statute was changed in the first place, recognizing that the out of service is a high financial burden that's imposed upon the building owner. And so this new category is an opportunity to remain in compliance at a lesser expensive cost that reaches the same objective, which is safety.
Well, and Brian Francis, it's another step and phase in what John was presenting of our ability to get the compliance of the elevator inspectors or the owners, and it's just another arrow in our quiver to get that compliance without making them feel compelled to litigate because it's so costly.
Brian, Jim Burnett, think of the word limbo, because if the unit is active, you're either in compliance or out of compliance. If you're limbo, you're in basically suspended animation until you can make that decision as an owner to what you want to do with that building and that elevator.
Great. I love that, but Charles won't let you put that in there.
FAQs.
John McGraw, I got one question, and my only concern in my several readings of this was, I understand the intent of it is to give the property owner a less expensive way to take the equipment out of service and to be able to bring it back into service at a lower cost. My obvious concern is that the less than honest property owner is going to use this as a way of getting off your radar screen.
Correct.
Is there a super penalty associated with them putting an elevator back into service
What?
without approval?
Yes.
I mean, it ought to be so onerous that nobody will even consider doing it.
I think you are now speaking to enforcement. Because at some point, once the bill is adopted, they will go back and revise the penalty matrix, and this will be taken into account. And I think that
Well, they'll come back to this body.
Yeah, it'll come back to you for review.
You're
as
going to
well.
have
an opportunity to weigh in
Yeah.
on it.
Yeah, so,
I have no issue with the language. What I have an issue with is there sufficient enforcement penalties to prevent somebody from getting off your radar screen and putting their equipment back in service? We've been fighting for years now just to get people to finally start registering their elevators. Now we're going to take people off the radar screen, and they might go for 10 years before anybody notices they're back in service again.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Francis, just Christina Kaiser just gave me the nod that they actually have this provision in the matrix that's going to come before you a little later. So you're going to be able to weigh in and really make a statement about how challenging it should be for somebody that breaks that gun.
And John, Jim Burnett, I mean, if it was reported to myself by an inspector that he noticed that a building where he removed an elevator from service a month ago, he went by there yesterday and noticed the elevator was running.
Right.
My first thoughts are gonna be that owner Even though enforcement will have to go by their penalty matrix, that's not one complaint, that's about 4 or 5 complaints. Because now the owner has falsified documents.
Falsified documents, yeah.
Removed the lock that the inspector installed.
Yeah.
Put a piece of equipment that was not in compliance back in service and endangered the public. So
Yeah.
we've got multiple complaints.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
All right, item 38, or I guess definition 38, reportable condition. Any comments on that from the board? Well, I'm sorry, again, let's,
Mr. Chairman, there was a comment filed.
Yes, I was just going back up to that, yeah.
Which may be a better walk through the rule.
okay, yeah, thank you, Charles, yeah, I just remembered that as well. So the proposed rules were put out on the Texas Register for 30 days for the public to respond, and there was one respondent. Is that correct, just the one respondent?
Yes, sir. Well, actually, there were two, but one was not relevant to the rulemaking, and that was referred to compliance for handling. And so there was only one comment that was relevant to the rulemaking.
Okay, all right. And that was filed by Lawrence Taylor. So do we want to go through what was on the register? Do we want to have Lawrence pipe up? How do we want to proceed with this, Charles? Because obviously all the board has it in writing here.
Yeah, it's really up to you, Mr. Chairman. Since it's in writing, I think it'd be more logical just for the board to walk through them one at a time without
Okay.
us interjecting our interpretation of what the comment is.
I agree. Okay, so can the board recognize Lawrence Taylor? You want to-
I certainly hope so.
I like to not to.
Yeah. The vast majority of my comments were editorial, to try to standardize the terms that were used to match up with what is in A17.1. For instance, in 8.11.1.4, installation placed out of service. And that's where Jim had talked about, you've got to land the car, land the counterweight, remove the ropes, bolt the door shut, cut the wires, and so forth and so on. And generally speaking, in my experience, when an owner does that, they probably never intend on restoring that elevator back to running again.
Yeah.
It's too old, it's costing too much money to fix, let's fix it so I never have to worry about it again. And removed from service is just exactly like Jim said, I don't have anybody in my building. Power's been turned off because I couldn't pay the bill. So I'm going to remove it from service, which will relatively easily allow me, when circumstances get better, to restore it to operation without any significant cost getting it out and without any significant cost getting it in, pending the other parts of the rules that tell you where you've got to have it inspected, tested, and so forth and so on. So that's why in most of my comments it's installation placed out of service, because that's a term directly out of the code book. Therefore, an installation removed from service is consistent with that, because it's going to be a different set of rules. I remove it from service, I'm going to only have to do these things. And most of the comments are editorial in that nature, to try to keep consistency, use the same terms, because Jim kind of hit it pretty well here a minute ago, to that field guy. If he knows anything about the code, if he sees the term installation placed from service, he's thinking removed from service. Yeah. Placed out of service, excuse me. See, my tongue got all tied up in my teeth and I couldn't see what I was saying.
Yeah.
If it says placed out of service and they have any code knowledge at all, they'll realize that this is a much more permanent act, whereas removed from service, much less stringent, and it just, using that word installation just follows what's in the code book already.
And from a compliance perspective, we've looked at that comment and agree that that language works just as well.
Okay, so that would be for 29 and 37?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
And for 38, reportable condition,
Well, I'm sorry, let's do these, so as far as changing the verbiage for 29 and 37, if all in favor of the board, say aye?
Aye.
And opposed? Okay,
Thanks, sir.
yes, thank you. So then 38, I'm sorry, Lawrence, go
and
ahead.
38, And I hope I didn't hurt anybody's feelings with the words legalese and all that kind of good stuff. That concept of in a manner reasonably calculated is impossible for your average John Q. public and building owner to know what that means to me. And so I just kind of rewrote it and used language directly out of the code book, because there is already in 8.6.1.2.2 a requirement when you have something that's dangerous, it is required by code already that's adopted in the state to remove it from service. So I've essentially a condition which exists where a defective part directly affecting the safety of operation is identified and requires the equipment to be rendered inoperative until the defective part has been adjusted, repaired, or replaced to prevent injury to passengers, operators, and the general public. And that's not word for word out of the code, but it gets about 80% of it. And I thought that read better, was easier for people to understand than in a manner reasonably calculated.
If I may, substitute, we kind of can't get away from legalese because it is a rule. And so we're kind of stuck with some basic concepts. And the concept of reasonably calculated is a fact issue based upon the circumstances, and so is the term part directly affecting, is a fact question. So we kind of can't get out of answering the fact questions, but whether something is directly related, that is ultimately subjective. And there's no reasonableness test to that. The reason we use reasonably calculated was because reasonably calculated is a recognized legal term. Something that's reasonably calculated as a reasonable person standard that we're talking about. But to say directly related is no standard at all, because that's totally subjective.
Well, this is Lawrence Taylor again. I would disagree with that,
Okay.
because Section 2.26.2 of the Elevator Code contains a complete list of electrical protective devices which are designed to protect the public. If any of them are defective, that is a part that directly affects the safety. The whole code book is titled Safety, and everything in it is safety. So,
And I think that's kind of where we go off, in that as proposed, it was a broad approach, but as the proposed amendment, it constricts it so that a piece could be not be reasonably could be reasonably calculated, but not directly. It may not be directly related. I mean, that directly related is a fact issue. It doesn't eliminate the determination as to whether or not it was reasonable or not, because reasonableness is written in a part of all these rules and so forth. But that's just as a clarification from our perspective.
This is
Brian
Lawrence again.
Francis
We
again.
obviously see things from a different perspective. I'm pretty sure plaintiff's attorney will tell you what is going to be reasonably calculated when the lawsuit occurs later on. But any required safety device, if it isn't working, that safety device is directly affecting the safety of the equipment. It wouldn't be a safety device if it wasn't. A car light bulb in a car is not a safety device because it's not listed that way. But there are specific devices that the code requires that says these shall be there, and then 8.6.1.2.2 directly, those items directly affect the safety of that equipment, or they wouldn't be in the code book in the first place.
And I think that's where the difference is, Mr. Taylor, is that is a specific reference, that there may be things that affect, that can be reasonably calculated to affect the equipment, but not fall into everything that is reasonably calculated may not be direct. I'm trying to work the
You're
logic.
making my case for me. Thank you very much.
It might not be defective.
Correct. So there's a subtlety in that distinction between reasonably calculated and directly related. One, reasonably calculated is a broader approach standard as opposed to directly related, which is specific. You've got to tie it exactly to a particular concern.
Well, if I was a building owner and I had to take my piece of equipment out, I'd want to know that whatever the reason I'm having to do it is because it directly affects safety. Making a guess about whether it does or not doesn't seem to be the position an owner should be in, to me.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Francis. So, I'm hearing you guys continue to speak yourselves into different corners. It's a fantastic job of that. I'm a layperson too. My experience is riding elevators. That's as far as it goes. And maybe pressing buttons on there. Can we find that middle ground? I heard, Chief Bernan say, may not be defective. And Lawrence, I'm definitely hearing what you're saying about the safe operation. Is there an opportunity to say maybe something like a condition which exists where the safe operation of the elevator is affected and requires the equipment to be removed from safety, removed from operation to prevent X, Y, and Z? That doesn't include the defective part, but it says the condition speaks to safe operation. It says that that condition has required the equipment to be removed to prevent a risk of injury to passengers, operators, or the general public. It doesn't include the in a manner reasonably calculated. It just speaks to there may be a condition that leads to affecting the safe operation of it. Therefore, the equipment has to be removed in order to prevent the risk of injury to the passenger, operator, or the general public.
I think I've got it. Let me spit this out and see if this works.
Come on, man. You and I poetize together.
Yeah, we
so
do
let's
it.
go.
All we got to do is just start doing it, right?
Here we go.
A condition which exists where the safety of the operation is identified requires the equipment to be rendered inoperative to prevent injury to passengers, operators, and the general public.
And I think, so that's not the precise wording, but I think it's
Something
in there.
similar to that.
It's in there because we are, and both of us will admit, we're being kind of redundant when we say safe operation identified and renders inoperative. It's kind of talking about the same thing from just a slightly different angle. However, the concept of there's a condition, it affects the safe operation, that has required it to be removed in order to prevent. Those are the key elements that need to be there. And it removes the defective part, it removes the in a manner reasonably calculated by, and so I think that gets us there, but I just put it out there for conversation. It's my job.
Well, that's
Job
just
description.
close.
Okay. Brian Morris, I think I agree with that, because I had trouble understanding, again, manner reasonably calculated as well. Is there any other discussion on that? So I guess on that one, is the board in agreement that the verbiage that Lawrence proposed, that staff will work on and polish?
I hereby propose we take Lawrence's intent and the staff's language.
Great. All in favor? Aye.
Mr. Chairman, question?
No.
No,
Is this a friendly amendment, or?
Yeah, no, Jim Renan, Chief Elton, could you just read that back?
It's
what
in
you just said?
here's recorded.
I'm not sure I can duplicate it, but I'll do my
It's
best.
recorded.
We've got the recording.
Okay, very good.
Yep.
Okay.
And we got his recording too.
And this is Lawrence again, and I'm not wedded to that exact verbiage by any means,
But those
but the
concepts,
concept.
I think what I'm hearing is that we're gonna remove reasonably calculated, and we're also gonna remove directly affecting, and the middle ground is what's left.
Pretty much.
Yes.
And we will take liberty to craft what's left in a rule format.
And I'll be glad to help you if you need it. Just
No,
call
sir.
me.
No, sir.
322 on the tape.
Sounds good to me.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so no more changes in that section other than just aligning the numbers. Move on to 74.50, adding section F.
The only concern we had about the proposed amendment to 7450 is it's awkwardly, and this may be just a drafting error, but it doesn't track.
What part of it doesn't track? Brian
It
Francis?
says, within 30 days of the date has become an installation.
That equipment should still be there.
Okay, because equipment is.
Yeah, that
struck
was a
out
mistake
mine.
on my
Okay,
part.
okay.
It
That's
should
what-
say, within 30 days, the date equipment has become an installation.
Okay.
That's
That makes sense.
a mistake on my part. I'm sure it was a cut and paste error.
I thought it was something similar.
Brian Morris, I have a comment. So but the inspector has 72 hours to report out of service, correct?
Removed.
The inspector has 72 hours to report that's removed from service, but the owner has 30 days? Did I misread something somewhere?
Brian?
Yes.
Mr. Morris, Jim Renan, what the inspector is gonna do is report online the same as he does an annual inspection, that a unit has been removed from service. So what that verbiage is then telling us is that the owner has 30 days to get us the paperwork to prove that that was done.
Okay. All right.
Including payment.
Correct.
Yeah.
He'll submit the inspection report with the removed from service category, the date written in with his $20 fee, and that'll be logged into our database, and it'll be good to go from there.
Okay. Any other comments on section 7450? All right, then the board will accept staff changes on that area.
But just to be clear, can we get a vote on that?
Okay,
Yeah, I mean,
everyone in favor of accepting staff recommendation of language on 74.50, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay.
Thanks,
that passes. Yes. 7455, added to remove from service to that, to the inspection requirements, reporting requirements as well.
Yep.
Okay, is all, everybody in favor of that recommendation? Say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And opposed? No. All right. The next section that Lawrence pointed out that I think needs some changes and modifications would be 74.66, which staff was not included within this.
and we have
Comment
reviewed
number
that comment
six.
and
Comment
have no
number
concerns.
six.
Comment 74.74.
Yeah, 74.74, comment 6. Right at the top of your screen.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chairman?
We
No.
didn't talk about that one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, yeah, we're not to 74 yet.
Okay.
It's out of order on
Yeah.
the screen.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Yes, Lawrence?
Having had some discussions, I've removed my objections to the way that 7466, my comments on that. I'm okay with the way the staff has done.
Now you go to 74.
Okay. All right. All right, well, in 74.69, there
69
were,
is next.
there were some revisions. All right, sorry, 69, all board members in favor of the staff recommendation to language change on that, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? None. 74.74, item J was added, but there was a recommended strike on the language, Lawrence?
I'm going to have to find it, Mr. Chairman, because I printed it out, and apparently I have
It's on page 28.
shuffled the pages
It's on-
somehow.
It's on page 28.
You have to go to our copy, Lawrence.
While he's finding that, we have also reviewed that comment and have no concerns.
There you go.
So concerned with the recommended.
Whatever Charles said.
With the recommended strikes?
Yep.
Concur with the recommended strikes?
Yes, sir.
So that would be
We'll-
comment 6 of 74.74?
No.
Yes, sir.
Well, it's this part.
Yeah, I mean, strike.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So, everybody in favor of that change at 74.74, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. Okay. 7480, added a fee for removal from service is $20 per unit.
Yep.
Again, I guess for me as a layman, is that enough?
Yes.
Okay.
We can always bump it.
Well,
But if we do, we have to republish.
Pardon me?
It's more than enough.
Okay. All right.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Jim Renan, on 74, 7480, excuse me, do we need to add the words installation removed from service, since that is what we agreed to go with?
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Okay. All board members in favor of those changes on 74.80, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? 74.105, Okay, I guess again, me, Brian Morris, as a layman, I had a question on that. Equipment may only be removed from service by a registered inspector. So a registered inspector is the one that has to go out there and do this? Not the owner, not the contractor?
We did not want the owner or the owner's employees touching the equipment. And so the options would be the inspector or the contractor. And recognizing the purpose of the amendment was to remove impediments and whether they be financial or otherwise, within the authority of the statute, which was to establish standards. And so in the course of establishing those standards, it became which of the two options is the least expensive on the building owner. And the decision point was that the inspector doing it would be less expensive and still comply with the requirements of the statute, which is to establish those standards.
I have a question. This is Nancy Crumley. This is for Jim and/or Lawrence, but on...
I could answer it.
Maybe. On number 1 for hydraulic elevators, we know how if you landed at the bottom floor, that packing could release and it could drift down, Jared. Should we not land it on pipe stands? Or, do you know what I'm saying? There have been many cases where all the oil's dumped out into the pit because it sat at that landing for a long time.
This is Lawrence. If the doors are closed, shouldn't matter where the elevator, if it settles a couple inches and settles down onto the springs, that shouldn't matter.
Right.
And to me, having it sitting on pipe stands is a little more dangerous than having it leak a little bit and set down on the springs. The doors are closed, nobody can get to it. John Q. Public doesn't have a door key to open the door to get in, not supposed to.
Maintenance man can't get below it.
Maintenance man can't get below it.
I'm looking at the building maintenance man, if it's
Right.
Kim Hernan, if it's on pipe stands, you know, even through our out of service per code, to bolt the doors shut at the floor where the elevator is, usually has to be done from the outside.
Right.
The other doors are bolted from the inside, so they can't be tampered with. So what I'm looking at is once that elevator is removed from service, we definitely do not want anyone but elevator personnel entering that hoistway. And if, in my experience, I've had numerous building maintenance men, if they could get underneath that elevator to, maybe I want to install a new sump pump while the elevator's out of service. We don't want him in there at that point because that elevator's removed from service. Let him do it later on where he can then hire his licensed contractor to spot the car and do it the right way. So I would rather have it on the springs, back to your question, because then the pit is inaccessible.
Right. I've just seen expensive repairs because all the oil's leaked out, so I just wanted to bring it up.
Okay. I mean, it's a valid point.
Cost of the oil compared to safety.
No, I understand. I
Yeah.
just wanted to throw that out there as a consideration.
If we'll take liberty, nothing in the rule prevents a building owner from placing an absorbent, I mean, if there's a oil leak, I mean, there are other ways to deal with it, other
We're
than.
talking about a couple hundred gallons, maybe.
Oh, well then, maybe not.
No oil.
Well, they could always drain it, but that's a decision.
Not every
But then
time.
it'll fall
Not
down.
every time. Is
I'm just.
theoretically,
I'm
it
just-
has happened.
Thinking out loud.
It has happened.
Okay. Any other board comments on 17, on the new section 17.105? Okay, all members in favor of the
Mr.
language
Chairman,
as...
did we address Mr. Taylor's comments? Because there's a nuance difference between ours and his. His calls for verification,
74.
Sorry.
and
105
ours
has
says
no-
only the registered
Yeah.
inspector can perform it, so
Oh, okay.
it's very different.
This is Lawrence again. Charles and I had discussed it, and I've removed my objection to the previous language that they had in there. So other than the, installation removed from service, I'm okay with that.
Okay. So all board members in favor of the language presented by staff on 17.105, say aye.
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? No opposition. That is those sections. All right.
Yeah, we will record your revisions and present it to the commission at the next commission meeting.
Okay. Very good.
Thank you, sirs. And ma'am?
Thank you. We'll move to item I on the agenda, discussion possible action on recommended changes to the three penalty matrices in the elevator, escalator, and related equipment program. Tracy, we got through all that. We will get through that for you.
Lots of pieces of paper here.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, board members. I'm Christina Kaiser. I'm the Director of the Enforcement Division here at TDLR. With me is Chris Russey, who is our Research and Analytics Specialist in the Enforcement Division. He's going to be assisting me with this presentation, and Chris is the person who actually does the bulk of the hard work on writing or updating the penalty matrices. So he actually needs to hear the feedback from you more than I do. At agenda item I in your materials, you have drafts of 3 revised penalty matrices that relate to the elevators, escalators, and related equipment program. Let me give you a little background because it's been a really long time since we've talked about one of these, so I'll start with just a little background of what these are and what they're for. The penalty matrix is published to the world, and it's intended to put the industry and the public on notice of the penalties and license sanctions that someone is subject to if they commit a violation of the statute or the rules. Inside our house, inside the Enforcement Division, it is also used as a guidance document for my prosecutors, such as John, who spoke to you earlier. When we get a case that reflects evidence of violations and we want to take action against an owner or a contractor or an inspector, the penalty matrix provides guidance as to what penalty we should ask for or what license sanction we should pursue against a licensed individual. The penalty matrix is not binding on our commission. When they make the final decision in a contested case, they are only bound by the limits of the law. However, as a practical matter, they have mostly followed the penalty matrix in recent years because I think they appreciate the consistency that it brings. A couple of things that the penalty matrix is not. It does not create law. That's really important for us to remember as we get into these discussions. The law is created only in the statute and the administrative rules that are adopted by the commission. The penalty matrix simply identifies violations that are present in the statute and the rules and then classifies them in a way that tells us what penalty to apply to them. So I often see board members, when we get into discussions of a penalty matrix, we lapse into discussions of, well, the rules really shouldn't say that. That's a discussion for a different day, for a different agenda item. All we're doing here, when we create a matrix, we scour through the statute, we scour through the rules, and we identify every provision that could give rise to a violation, and then we lift those out and we drop them into this matrix format, and then we organize them according to how serious they are in the classes, as you see represented there, with Class A being the least serious and so forth. So that's real important to bear in mind. This is not new law we're talking about. This is law that's already in place. Another thing the penalty matrix is not is it is not a representation of the entire range of possibilities that are there for a prosecuting attorney when we work cases. We have many opportunities to resolve cases informally And we do, although we do that probably less in the elevator program than in some others, but we do have discretion to resolve cases informally if violations are brought into compliance or if a consumer is made whole. The penalty matrix only applies if we're going to be seeking formal enforcement action. It doesn't apply to those informal methods of resolving cases. As you can see, you do have 3 matrices in front of you, and that is because there are 3 distinct types of entities that are regulated by this statute and these rules. There are the building owners, there are the inspectors, and then the contractors. Matrices for these 3 types of entities were last published in April 2007, so 8 years ago. So we've got quite a bit of change that's happened since then. The most important reason for bringing updated matrices to you today is because we want to bring the violations and the citations of law in line with the current statute and the rules. Now, if you compare these drafts that we put in your materials with the matrices that were published way back in 2007, you'll see that today's versions are a lot longer. They're a lot fatter. And that's because the statutes and the rules have become a lot fatter during the ensuing 8 years. More detailed responsibilities have been added for all of those types of regulated entities, owners, contractors, and inspectors, primarily aimed at increasing safety. Specifically, the elevator statute has been amended every legislative session since 2007. That's 5 legislative sessions. The changes to the statute in 2 of those legislative sessions had the most impact on the penalty matrix drafts that we have in front of you. Those were statute changes that happened in 2011 and 2013. In 2011, the legislature passed House Bill 2643, which added several requirements for contractors. Now, the contractor registration had already been there for a while. It was added to the law in 2003. But in 2011, the legislature added the insurance requirement for contractors. They added continuing education requirements for contractors, and the contractor's requirement to designate a responsibility to complete continuing education. Very significantly, the legislature in 2011 also added the plan review requirement for new installations and alterations, and y'all have discussed that quite a bit today. In 2013, the legislature amended the statute again in Senate Bill 673. Senate Bill 673 added authority for the Commission to adopt rules on several really big subjects, again related to safety. Those subjects included standards for the testing of equipment. That is in addition to standards that were already authorized for installation, maintenance, alteration, and several other areas. Testing was a new area. Authority was added for the Commission to adopt rules regarding documentation that had to be maintained, such as maintenance control programs, manuals, and testing procedures. The agency was also authorized to adopt rules regarding the manner of filing information with the department, including by electronic means. Senate Bill 673 also made several changes relating to owners. It reduced the time limits to file an annual inspection report and for reporting accidents. It added a direct statement of the owner's obligation to maintain equipment in compliance with the standards and codes adopted by the Commission. That's a really big deal from the enforcement perspective. That had always kind of been implied from a bunch of different angles, but to see it directly stated in the law was a really good thing for us. This bill also made several changes relating to inspectors. It reduced the time limit to submit an inspection report to the owner. It added the express requirement for continuing education for inspectors. Previously, inspectors were required to do some education, but it was more along the lines of one-time educational programs that were created by the agency. This bill also added authority for disciplinary action against either an inspector or a contractor for certain things such as falsifying a report submitted to the agency or obtaining a registration by fraud. So again, those were the 2 big statute changes that had an impact on what you're going to see in these matrices. The rules, the administrative rules for this program have been amended 6 times since 2007. Out of those, 3 of them had a significant impact on the matrices, and these were rule changes that happened in 2008, 2012, and 2013. I'm not going to cover those in huge detail, but I'll talk about them generally a little bit. Generally, those rule changes incorporated the statute changes that I just talked about into the rules. And these rule changes also further beefed up the safety responsibilities of all three of the licensed regulated entities, owners, contractors, and inspectors. There were several big themes in these changes, and if you've read through the matrices, these will sound familiar to you because you've seen them sprinkled all throughout the matrices. Those themes of these beefed up responsibilities included reporting things to the department, like accidents, reportable conditions, and equipment found without a decal, taking equipment out of service when certain things happen, such as accidents and reportable conditions being discovered, re-inspection and recertification before returning equipment to service after it had been taken out of service, shortened deadlines for actions related to inspection reports and for reporting certain things to the department. The plan reviews was a very big theme, making sure the installation or the alteration work complied with the plan review and also not putting the equipment in operation until it did comply. That documentation, again, that we mentioned a moment ago, the maintenance of documentation relating to the operation and the upkeep of the equipment. Keeping that documentation such as maintenance control programs, manuals, testing procedures, and making sure it was on site before certain things happened, like inspections or placing equipment in service. And finally, more detailed responsibilities relating to testing of equipment. Beyond the updates to reflect the current statute and rules, these matrices also include some other significant changes. We cleaned up some of the language to clarify how the violations are described in the matrix. We put in some violations that had been in the law for a long time but were left out of previous matrices. We added subject matter headings within each class to make it easier to find a particular violation in the matrix. We tried to use words that are descriptive of actions that the regulated person is required to take. This is a change that we have made in other penalty matrices and other programs, and it's been well received. The feedback has indicated that it makes the matrix easier for someone to find a particular violation that they might be looking for. Important to note, these matrices also reflect increased penalties and higher license sanctions for a lot of violations. This is in keeping with the heightened emphasis on safety that has been reflected in the statute and rule changes in previous recent years. We also moved a few existing violations to higher or lower classes. And if you flip through the matrices, you'll see a few violations that are reflected in italics. Those are violations that would be created by the rule changes that you discussed today. So those are sort of there in a speculative way, assuming the commission adopts the rule changes that you proposed, then those would be the matrix changes that would need to happen as a result of those rule changes. It's unusual that we catch up that quickly with a rule change, but since we had the meeting that happened before, we were ready for it. Now, what I will need to do with you next is sort of walk through each of the three penalty matrices, and I'm going to need feedback from you about a couple of really important things. The first thing that we'll want to hear from you is about how serious the violations are. We do our best when we put new violations into a matrix to organize them according to how serious we think they are, but we don't always get that right. And so we want to hear from you. The violations that are within each class should be about the same level of seriousness. So everything that's in Class A should be about the least serious stuff in there. As you move up from A to B to C, you should be moving into higher and higher levels of how serious the violations are. So if you see something that's placed in the wrong place, please tell us that. What I try to do when we walk through a matrix is to first have that discussion about are things organized correctly according to seriousness from the least to the most. And then after we kind of get that straight, then have a discussion about the penalties. As you can see, we've changed the penalties on a lot of these classes of violations. So the second thing that I guess we'll need to hear your feedback about is the penalty amounts. Do you like the higher amounts? Do you want to see them lower, higher? What is your pleasure? And then finally, as we're walking through, if you could please kind of pay attention to the new subject matter headings that we put in there, and tell us if those aren't helpful to you. They're intended to be helpful to make it easier to find things. If they're not helpful, if you think there's a better way for us to express something, let us know that. Ultimately, after we discuss each of the three matrices, what we're hoping from you is that you will recommend that the commission adopt these new matrices to be part of TDLR's enforcement plan. So if, with your approval, would you like to start walking through the first one?
Yes, I would. If I may, Grayson needs to leave at 4 o'clock, so I'll afford him the opportunity if he has anything to comment or mention about any of these.
I do not. Thank you,
Okay.
Brian.
All right. Yes, Christina, so I get, or does anybody have a general comment before we jump into this about any of the matrices? Okay. So the first section would be the cases against inspectors.
Right.
So as board members, have you scanned through the categories that are in Class A, B, C, and D, and have any comments at this point whether they're in the appropriate locations?
Good to me.
All right. So as far as classing and moving things around between Class A, B, and C, it appears that everybody's in agreement with the way that you all have categorized that. On that first page, I do have a comment about the inspection documentation violations box.
Okay.
The last line. Use department inspection form to report inspection results for exemption or construction use equipment. In that section that you cite in the rules, it says elevators, construction use elevators.
Okay.
So an elevator is not an equipment, an elevator is equipment, but equipment covers other stuff. So your language there is not consistent with the rule. But then also looking at that, on a construction site, is there equipment other than an elevator?
There could be a dumbwaiter or an escalator, but they
Okay.
generally wouldn't be for construction use only. It's Nancy Crumley, sorry.
All right, then on 74.75,
Can you pull up that
D,
rule?
in the rules, again, it says for construction use, only elevators. So is the terminology in that section inconsistent?
Yeah, I think we got general, and using elevator to match here, Kaiser, I think would be appropriate.
I wanted to look at the rule because there are two categories of things. There's exempt, and then there's construction use only, and exempt might have referred to equipment, and that might be why we got that word.
Okay. You just have to modify the
Yeah.
appropriate thing.
And again, one thing to bear in mind is obviously the violations are reflected in these matrices in a paraphrased or shortened fashion. It is not, we are not making an effort to track the language of the rule, or these things would be twice as long as they are.
Understand.
I agree that we don't want to be inaccurate,
But
however.
I guess that kind of brought to mind, then in the rule, should elevator actually not be elevator, should be equipment, for construction use equipment?
I was looking at the, Brian Francis,
Which
at the
one is
body
it?
language of the, of Mr. Taylor and even Ms. Crumley. As they went through the process, it seemed like you're not gonna have construction use only escalator. You could have an escalator that's there during construction, but
Yeah.
it's not gonna be for construction use only. The elevator is probably the appropriate device in that scenario.
So the rule refers to exempt equipment and construction use only elevators.
Okay,
So
That would
should we modify the language that way?
Yes.
For exempt equipment or construction use only elevators? Okay.
Ms. Taylor, could you finish the thought on where the chairman was going on,
Well,
should it be?
when you look in
construction
the elevator code in section 5.10, elevators are the only thing that is approved for construction use.
Okay.
And we do not have regulatory authority over dumbwaiters because people can't ride. So that wouldn't apply, and as you correctly pointed out, you wouldn't use an escalator for construction use.
Okay.
I
Thank you.
I'd appreciate, Mr. Chairman, if somebody would let my wife know that I do have skills of observation that are accurate.
When you want to.
There's much debate in my house.
Excuse me,
If
When
the
you want
TV
to.
isn't on.
I don't think that's an item on our agenda today.
Nice.
Excuse me? Brian, I don't think that's an item on our agenda today.
No, you're right, that's right. I gotta come for public comment on that one.
Yeah, so,
Were there other comments that you wanted to make about the Class A in the inspector's matrix? One thing I wanted to point out is some of the subject matter headings. You'll see if you move on to the second page that there's a category called reporting violations. And that was one of those common themes that was actually applicable to both inspectors and contractors. And so when you look in the contractors matrix, you're going to see a similar category called reporting violations. For inspectors, the word report actually has multiple meanings. There's the concept of reporting things to the department when certain things occur, but then there's also the physical written inspection report that an inspector has to turn in. So to differentiate between those two types of things, that's why we use the other category of inspection documentation violations. That's relating to the actual report, that document that the inspector turns in. So I hope that distinction is clear, because you'll see reporting elsewhere.
okay.
Do you feel like these violations in Class A accurately reflect sort of the least serious things that you're likely to see an inspector do? You'll see that one of the italicized items is in Class A. That is relating to the rule changes that you just approved earlier today, failing to report each piece of equipment within 72 hours using that online system.
Christine, would it be better for you if we approve these as we go along, or just when we get done in total?
Why don't we just do them as we go along?
Okay, all right,
You mean like by class?
yes,
Okay.
okay.
So with Class A, the one change that you've proposed to the language on that one violation is the only change that you're recommending for Class A?
So the board in agreement with that, would you say aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? No opposition? Okay.
In Class B, you'll see that we have the unlicensed activity violation of an inspector acting without being registered. You'll also see that we have some standards of conduct violations in Class B and then some more in Class C. In the previous version of the matrix, they were all clumped together in Class C. But we thought, after we looked through them kind of in a more thoughtful way, that some of the standard of conduct violations were probably a little less serious, so those we dropped down into Class B. So you might want to look at those two in comparison with one another, those in Class B and C, to make sure you kind of agree with that distinction. Those in Class B include things like stating or implied that the department will grant a delay or waiver performing an inspection where the inspector's employer also has a contract to perform services. The ones in Class C include things like engaging in activity that constitutes dishonesty, misrepresentation, or fraud. Failure to avoid a conflict of interest, things that, in my opinion, are more serious. Yes, sir.
This is Lawrence Taylor. I don't have any problem with any of this, but for instance, under unlicensed activity, they don't have a license. What are you going to do about it? Because they don't have a license at all. You can't take it from them. You can't revoke it. You can't suspend it. That looks like, to me, that's a pretty serious, maybe that should be a little, not a Class B, maybe a C.
Okay.
Because that really is a betrayal of the public trust by having somebody pretending to be a safety person and then lying about it. But,
Would you propose a similar change with regard to contractors? Because I believe
Absolutely.
in
Yes,
contractors,
ma'am.
we also
Yeah.
put it in Class B.
Because you can't threaten to take a license they don't have.
Right,
but
we
you
can only
can
penalize someone.
Penalize the
Right.
Hades out of them.
Right.
So I think that would have much more of a deterrent, although the history has shown a person who's apt to do that is not going to be influenced by the amount of the penalty in the first place.
You're probably right.
Right.
But the higher the potential penalty, that one person who's wobbling and thinking maybe or maybe not, might push them to do the right thing, maybe.
Yes, sir. Do the board members generally agree with that suggestion, to move the unlicensed violation to Class C?
John McGraw, I do, yeah.
Okay.
Well, is C enough, or is that D, or is it D, C, or is it C or D?
Well, this is Lawrence again. I certainly wouldn't have an objection to see it in D, that's for sure. But it just seems like B is a little light-handed, because you had to do that on purpose. That's not a mistake.
And Mr. Chairman, Brian Francis, one of the things that Mr. Taylor hit on that's on point is that unlike a lot of our programs, this person is acting as an extension of the state. They are doing this job really on our behalf, perform these inspections with our authority. And that's a big deal if you've got somebody that's going to go out there and represent themselves to be licensed or registered with the state to do this. So it has a lot of seriousness to it. So I agree.
Well, I think in that regards with them, Brian Morris, with them not being registered or having a license, really the only difference between C and D is suspending or revocation. The upper dollar limit is the same, $5,000 is
Right.
the same.
However, you'll see that in C, there is a range of dollar amount from $1,000 to $5,000, while in D, there is no range.
Right.
There is just $5,000.
Which is 5,000 period.
If you care to hear my recommendation would be to put the violation in Class C to allow the prosecutor some discretion, because you may have a situation where someone is acting without a license because they allowed their license to expire. And if they take action promptly to get their license renewed when or their registration renewed when they're supposed to, that's a little different scenario to me than someone who's been just rogue out there acting with no license at all. So to allow the range of penalties to account for those different scenarios would be my preference.
This got mentioned, I'm a bit of a novice, of course, on the actual procedures, but if he's not licensed, is he going to be able to do any reporting on his inspections? I mean, how's he going to send it in? I mean.
That's a good question.
Well,
I
it
don't
could
know.
come in the mail. I mean, those things could happen, passing strings. Not anyone in this room speaking right now, but, sometimes you miss deadlines, and the deadline is missed here, and your activity took place just the day before.
Well, it just seems if somebody's going to be doing this, they're just trying to pull a sham and going to get some cash and go on the way, and then you got a whole nother.
Right.
You got criminal, basically
You
it's.
got some jeopardy.
Right. And we've actually seen.
I don't
yeah.
think you're dealing with something here that is really even going to fit into your, if somebody fits this profile, they aren't going to be in your matrix. They're going to be long
Yeah,
gone.
they're going to be long, yeah.
Mr. Chairman, Jim Renan.
Jim, go to the mic, please. Thank you. Why don't you come sit over here next to me? Yeah.
Is he becoming Bill Coons now? Hey, going uptown.
They gave
Somebody.
Jared my job earlier. They called him deputy executive director. I was like,
If I'm Mr. Coons, no fine, hang him, no. I think you're gonna see that more on the contractor side than you are the inspector, because without the license number for the inspector, he's not gonna be able to report anything on our system. But I've actually run across a couple of these, and what Christina says is a valid point. We had one contractor out there who just was operating without a license, period. We had another young man who honestly did not know. He was on the residential side and went by the status quo, what he was told from many years ago, that if you did home lifts, you're not required to have a license. He has since paid his fine, gotten a license, and is now a very reputable contractor down in the San Antonio area. So it worked in a positive light on that part. I haven't run across any non-licensed inspectors. Maybe Lawrence could clarify on that, but I haven't run across it yet.
Yeah, this is Lawrence. I only remember one, and it was a guy who slid across the state line from New Mexico into El Paso. And he was a QEI inspector, but he was not a licensed Texas inspector. And he was caught and fled across the state lines and is out in the Badlands of New Mexico somewhere.
With Rosa?
Any more board discussion on Class B? So the recommendation is to move the unlicensed activity to a Class C.
Yep.
Okay. Everybody in favor of that, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No opposition. Class C.
At the beginning of Class C, where you see the things struck through, those are all violations that we moved down to Class B and are now part of that standards of conduct grouping in Class B. In Class C, you'll see another new category appear, violations in conducting an inspection. We're in Class C now, so this is the next to the highest class. So we're getting into the more serious violations here. Performing an inspection in a negligent or incompetent manner, failure to inspect all equipment for compliance with the applicable standards. Your plan review violations that inspectors can commit are located in this class. Look at the last couple of bullets before the bottom, failed to verify that installations or alterations comply with the approved application and plans, or failed to compare the installation with the approved application and plans. Under safety violations, you'll see one of the new violations from the rules y'all just discussed, failed to properly remove equipment from service. And then some more serious violations relating to inspection documentation, such as falsifying an inspection report or failing to note a reportable condition on an inspection report. There's one violation under reporting violations. There's one violation that we moved up from Class B to Class C. Failed to notify the department of a reportable condition within 24 hours. That's the second bullet under reporting violations. We thought that was serious enough to put it in Class C. And then, of course, the more serious standards of conduct, which we've already talked about.
Okay, board, having reviewed Class C classifications, any comments? Okay, all members in favor of accepting that as presented, say aye.
Aye.
I opposed? No opposition.
And then finally, Class D are violations that we consider sort of the drop-dead violations. If a person has an order against them from a contested case and they violate a provision of that order, we want to be able to penalize them at the highest level that's available to us under the law, which is $5,000 per violation per day, or we want to be able to revoke their license. So you see we have the option there of either or. Obtaining a license or registration by fraud is another big deal. The final violation on the last page has to do with someone who submits a check or maybe a credit card payment to the department and then it's dishonored. The department, the Financial Services Division makes diligent efforts to collect on a dishonored payment. If it's not made good by the person who submitted it to the agency, they will refer that to the Enforcement Division, and then we make diligent efforts to try to collect on it. But ultimately, if all of that is for naught, we want to have the authority to revoke someone's license for that, because we feel like ultimately they haven't honored their obligation to the agency if they're not making good on a payment. So that's why that violation is here in Class D.
My only comment is I really want to meet the person who makes it to a third violation.
Yeah, that's
Right.
Or not meet him.
Head overachiever. He's really gone after it. You got to try.
That's grand. I have one question.
Okay.
This is Lawrence Taylor again. Since Ann Richards signed that bill that made the elevator law on May 8th, 1993, by the way, has anybody ever had an inspector's license revoked in this state?
I don't know.
Well, I know that the answer is no. And in 22 years, a lot of these offenses has been committed, but to my knowledge, there has never been a registered elevator inspector who has had their registration
Right.
revoked. And that, to me, sends, so you obviously don't want to revoke anybody who doesn't deserve it, but that sends a pretty good message to a person who would be inclined to do it, is they've never done it in 22 years. What's the chances of them doing it to me?
I know that's right.
'Cause,
Maybe we just have really good inspectors.
we do have some.
We have more good than bad. No doubt about it.
No doubt about that. But I recall some time back, there was an inspector who had his QEI certification revoked for violating his accrediting agency's certification. And I tried to get his Texas registration revoked and was told can't do that.
Don't remember that.
Hopefully Charles would if he was here. But it doesn't mean much if a deserving party doesn't have that happen to them once in a while. Not recklessly, obviously, but there have been a number of, and I see Jim nodding his head, people that if we were God for a day, would have had that happen to. Permanently.
I have a question.
That's why it's called revocation.
This is Nancy Crumley. Back to Scott's comment, after the third violation, if there is a fourth violation, does this go on forever, or is that automatic revocation?
The first, second, and third violations are, they're not unique to classes. They are chronological. So if someone commits their first violation, say, and it's a Class B violation, and we get an order entered against them, then a year later they commit another violation and we decide that that's a Class C violation, we're going to seek the second violation category against that person, even though it's a Class C violation. If we have someone who's a fourth, then at that level, the circumstances are probably so unusual that there's not a need to apply a matrix. It would just be a case-by-case analysis that prosecutor will go through with me to determine the amount of penalty or sanction that we would pursue against somebody. A person getting a fourth violation is something we rarely see. So,
Yeah, and so we can go to the items in Class D. Any more comments, discussions? All board members in favor of that classification, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No opposition? So that wraps up.
This is Scott, I just want to, I
Inspectors?
love the idea that you'll, in certain cases, you just have to, address it on a case by case. I mean, once you
Yes.
get to a certain point, so.
Right.
I think that's a very good way to deal with
And-
that situation.
right, and even in, someone's first or second violation, if the circumstances are really unusual, the prosecutor, with my approval, can go outside of the penalty matrix in the sanction or the penalty that we're pursuing. It's just that generally, we try to have the matrix in place because consistency among cases is a big deal to our commission and our executive leadership. So as to the matrix for inspectors, do we need to discuss the changes in the penalty amounts? Or are you comfortable with those being increased at the levels that they are? I think clearly the feedback I've heard has been in favor of stronger enforcement, so I'm hoping this is good.
Yes.
So then should we move on to the contractors? We already did the biggest one, so these other two should be a little bit easier to get through. The lowest class for contractors violations includes administrative and reporting violations like failing to notify the department within 30 days of changes to your registrant information, failing to retain a copy of a certificate of completion for a continuing education course, and then the low-level insurance violations, failing to file proof of insurance with the department or failing to provide insurance information to a consumer. There is a violation in a higher class for not having the insurance, which is, what we would consider very serious. Any suggestions regarding Class A for contractors?
Okay, any discussion and comments? Okay, all board members in favor of the items in Class A, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No opposition.
In Class B, we have the violation of unlicensed activity. There was discussion earlier about moving that to Class C for contractors as well. Is that generally agreeable to all the board members?
Yep.
Okay. Under the heading of documentation violations in Class B, you have violations that relate to the approved application and plans. There are some provisions that require the contractor to provide those to the inspector and to leave those in a certain location at the property. There are also some other violations that have to do with those other kinds of documents. Remember in that last round of statute changes, well, not the last, but the next to last, 2013 statute changes, there were some provisions added for things like maintenance control plans and testing procedures and, you know, parts, diagrams, all kinds of really detailed things that had to be provided to the owner. So that's the third, fourth, and fifth violations there under documentation violations is relating to those things. Here you see the plan review violations that contractors can commit, failing to submit the application and plans before beginning an installation or before beginning an alteration, or failure to resubmit when changes are made. And then those lower level standard of conduct violations similar to what we already discussed in the inspector's matrix. Any observations or suggestions for changes here?
Just question, Scott Anderson. What is meant by failed to provide reasonable notice to client upon withdrawal? I mean, that they're just leaving the work site and didn't tell?
There are two violations there that relate to the same rule section, 7472H. Can you pull that up? There's a provision in the standards of conduct in the rules that says you must withdraw from employment in certain circumstances. We can look at what the language exactly says, but if you do that, then you have to give reasonable notice to the client that you're doing that.
Okay.
Can't leave them in a lurch.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just,
Can you read it because I can't see that part?
Registrant must withdraw from employment when it becomes apparent that it is not possible to faithfully discharge the duty and performance of a service owed to the client. The registrant must provide reasonable notice to the client of the registrant's withdrawal.
So not,
basically, if they get in over their head, they gotta tell them that.
it kind of sounds like that. Not
Okay.
possible to faithfully discharge the duty and performance of services owed to the client.
John McGraw, that would also hold true for if they just weren't making money on the job and just wanted to walk away.
The second part of it,
Yeah.
giving reasonable notice to the
Right.
client? Yes, sir.
Any more discussion on the Class B violation? So, go ahead.
Back to the Charles reasonable. This is Nancy. What's reasonable notice?
Is that what the rule says? Yes. That's the language that's used in the rule. So this, again, this document is not creating new law. I can tell you that if that were the subject of a complaint with us, the determination of reasonableness would depend on the facts of that particular case and what condition the client was left in by this person withdrawing and not giving notice.
So other than moving the unlicensed activity to a Class C, all board members in favor of Class B, other items as listed, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? And no opposition.
Okay. In Class C, again, you'll see some violations that were struck at the beginning. Some of those were actually removed. The first two that are struck out were actually removed from the statute of the rules. The other three were moved down to Class B. Here in Class C, now again, this is the next to the highest class, you'll see the insurance violation of failing to maintain general liability insurance. You'll see some reporting violations like falsifying a report or failing to notify the owner and the department of a reportable condition. You'll also see what we consider the more serious standard of conduct violations like activity that constitutes dishonesty misrepresentation, or fraud. There are also a couple of safety violations in Class C, and these are similar to some violations in the inspector matrix, performing installation, repair, or maintenance in a negligent or incompetent manner. You might remember talking about negligent and incompetent in the inspector's thing a moment ago. Also failing to apply for a new technology variance before installing something that was not permitted by current standards.
I have a comment on that one, on that block, the safety. The first bullet, performed elevator installation, repair, maintenance. Again, consistency, I assume that should be equipment.
You're
instead of elevator.
probably right. Let's look at that rule and make sure. We could maybe just take the word out altogether and just say performed installation, repair, or maintenance.
Equipment inspection.
It says equipment.
Yeah.
Well, that's the inspection one. Okay, equipment.
I mean, it could be construed that all they're going to get penalized for is on the equipment. He does
Yeah.
an escalator, well, that's not in the penalty matrix.
Yeah, you're right. Would you like us to put the word equipment instead of elevator, or just take it out altogether?
I assume equipment makes it consistent with the standard.
Okay.
We're talking about equipment.
But let me look back at the, just to be sure, I'm going to look back at the inspector one and make sure we didn't do the same thing there. In the inspector one, we just said performed an inspection in a negligent or incompetent, so that's fine. Okay. Change it to equipment. Were there other suggestions regarding, what class are we in now? C?
Class C.
I had one question. This is Lawrence Taylor again. Under reporting violations, falsified a report submitted to the executive director. Just what kind of report would the elevator contractor submit to the executive director that he could falsify?
I don't know. This is a provision that was added to the statute, and so because it's in the statute, we have to reflect it in the matrix. It may be referring generally to reports, like things that have to be reported to the department generally, like discovering equipment without a decal is something that has to be reported to the department. So the language might have just been very specific about the executive director. That's what I'm guessing.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Any other comments or discussion on Class C? Okay. All board members in favor of that change?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? And no opposition.
And then finally, Class D contains the same violations that we discussed in the inspector matrix.
Any comments or discussion on Class D? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? No opposition.
And then finally, we have the matrix for building owners. In Class A, the lowest class, you'll see posting violations, failing to display the certificate of compliance in the publicly visible area, or failing to follow all the specific requirements having to do with placement of it. Failing to have copies of all current department-issued waivers, delays, and variances posted in the required location. Reporting violations include excuse me, failing to notify the department that equipment was placed out of service.
Removed from service, not out of service.
Well, there are two different
There are
things.
two
There is an
different
out of
things.
service.
Yeah.
That should really read,
But
this
that's
is
the one
Lawrence.
in italics means that it goes to the removed.
Right.
So you gotta get the right terminology there.
Well, you got a placed out of service and a removed from service, so shouldn't it be both?
Should be both.
There are two different provisions, excuse me. There are two different provisions in the rules, so they need to be reflected separately. Were you going, Mr. Taylor, were you going to suggest a change in the language for?
Well, no, the language itself is fine, but you've got two things that you can do, is you can, in an installation placed out of service, which is one where, as we discussed earlier, where it's pretty much intended to never use it again. And then you've got an installation removed from service, which is that lesser category to where as soon as I can get some tenants in the building, I'll put it back. But both of them are required, and it looks like the punishment should be the same for either of those.
So it just needs another bullet for.
They're both there.
placed out of-
The first bullet under reporting violations is the more permanent.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Placed out of service.
Okay.
The italic one at the bottom is reflecting the new
Oh.
rules that you discussed today.
I did not see that. Please strike those previous remarks.
Yes, sir.
That was a test.
Christina, this is Nancy Crumley. I do have a question. Back under posting violations, the fourth one down, owner failed to display proof of inspection at the required location. Is that relevant today with the inspector putting the sticker on? The owner's not putting that sticker on. So how does the owner display proof of inspection?
We can look at the rule, but I believe the proof of inspection is the thing you get the very first time you get an inspection.
No, it says, number 3 says that the first time. So I take number 4 to mean,
For the first
Your
time,
certificate
the
of
owner must
compliance.
display.
right, which is on the third bullet.
The third bullet, this is probably us trying to cut things too fine. The third bullet is failing to display the proof of inspection at all. The fourth one is you displayed it, but you didn't put it in the right place.
Oh, okay.
Is there a better way to say
I
that?
see what you're saying.
I think it makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
The location defined. Okay. Right, so you're covering it both times, the initial and the annual.
Right.
Now, I don't know why it would move between the two, but.
Were there other thoughts regarding Class A?
Nope. Okay, no further discussion. Everyone in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No opposition. I'm sorry, and one thing that I didn't realize until I just saw it right now, all of these, everybody else I'm sure saw it, these are all for per unit of equipment. Because of their Class A bracketed per unit of equipment. And
Right.
that's consistent for the owner on each piece of equipment.
Yes, sir.
So the violations for the inspector or the contractor is basically per building, per site, whether there's 5 pieces of equipment there or 10 pieces.
The violations by an inspector or a contractor will be on a per violation basis as well. But the things that they do are the cases we get are typically, limited to one set of circumstance with one owner. I mean, we could add the same language in their matrices as well if you want us to, but.
Well, I mean, that's a huge difference.
The only thing is, John McGraw, the only thing I can't really see on anything that was listed there is why you would, for example, post a certificate for one elevator and not for another one. So I think it's going to be a single, it's going to be a single violation if I understand you correctly. Even if you fail to do it you've got 5 elevators, you fail to do it, it's a single violation, correct?
It could conceivably be 5 violations.
Right.
In practice.
In practice, it's
we're
probably not.
Probably not going to do that.
Because clearly, if I'm not going to put them up for elevator number 1, I'm not going to probably put it up for elevator number
Right.
5. Yeah.
And the other consideration with regard to Class A in particular is those are the least likely cases where we're going to seek a penalty in the first place.
Sure.
So.
Well, Well, I guess I could maybe say that for A's and B, for Class A, Class B, for the inspector and contractor. But going into C and D, is it, again, you go to a office building that has 5 elevators and you, or 5 alterations, and there's, would that be 5 separate set of plans? If 5 elevators are being altered or installed, is that 5 different plans? Or is that one set of plans?
Jim Renan, Chief Elevator Inspector, no, you could do one plan review for all 5 elevators as long as you're doing all the, you could actually do different work on each elevator as long, because there's spaces for a listing of 4 different units on there. So technically, for an alteration plan review, you can list 4 different units and do 4 different things, correct? So.
Then if you inspect it on one elevator, they do it, or you have the plans, but you don't do it on the other 3, that's just 1 violation? Or is that 3 violations?
By the inspector?
Yes.
If the
Or
inspector,
contractor. Or contractor.
well, if the inspector inspects 3 different elevators and fails to compare them with the plans that have been approved, I would view that as 3 separate violations.
Right.
Because that's 3 different
Decals, 3 different units.
scenarios.
Okay. So is that inherently interpreted in the way it's presented? Or?
Well, every potential violation and every penalty or license sanction here in all of these matrices is on a per violation basis. You're right, it is inconsistent that we have the per unit of equipment language in the cases against building owners. We can remove that. It's not gonna make any difference in.
Help?
You're still gonna treat it
I'm
the same
confused.
way.
Yeah, we're still gonna be on a applying the matrix on a per violation basis, whatever is reflected in the facts of that case. Whether it's an inspector or a contractor or a building owner. I think this is a hangover, this language being in here per unit of equipment is a hangover from a previous draft of the matrix where we thought that was significant.
This got interesting. It'll also depend on whether it's an A, a B, or a C as to how they deal with it. I mean, on an A, probably a little bit more lenient with the way on the
Right.
per unit.
And that was back to my previous question, that is a per unit one site on an A or B violation, but once you get into C, no, it was, like I said, that inconsistency just kind of popped out at me, and to me, it's a night and day difference.
Would you like us to remove it?
I don't know.
If they're all being treated the same way, then they should all look the same.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you gotta treat them all the same way and just,
So so we're saying the per unit we're gonna add per unit to inspector and contractor?
Or remove it.
or remove it.
Or remove it, but does that make their job harder?
No, it
No.
doesn't.
Okay.
What you're telling, sorry, John McGraw, what you're telling me, you're usually applying it as a single violation, even if there's multiple, as it is now, so.
Well, no, that's not really what I'm telling you, but in a Class A, in the lower classes, we're less likely to pursue those violations if that's the only violations that are present in a case anyway. Those would be more likely to be resolved informally in some way, like, fix it, put your certificate up in the right place, and let's get on with life. But if we are going to charge violations, we charge them on
By
a
the unit.
per violation basis in what John was just telling me is like by decal number.
Okay.
So,
And this is Lawrence here to help you with that. There is a definition in the statute of unit of equipment. And it says 1 elevator, 1 escalator, chairlift, platform lift, automated people mover,
Basically
and so
a
forth.
decal.
And so basically a decal.
Yeah.
right. So we can remove the language. It doesn't really add any value, and it does suggest that we're treating building owners in a different way when really we're not.
Right.
The implications. So remove it.
Okay.
Okay, Scott Anderson, just I'm gonna go, just an actual case highlight. This deal, the Austin Hotel they had 6 pieces of equipment. I mean, how did we deal with those 6 pieces of equipment at the Austin Hotel that we got $15,000 in penalty fees from?
Each decal?
John, will you please, thank you very much, appreciate it.
Yeah. John Millick with enforcement. Basically what we did is on each decal, there was a violation per each decal.
Okay.
So each unit was assessed a violation in that case.
Okay, all right, then yeah, then that's fine. If you're all handling it that way, then if it's the desire of the board to remove that terminology to be consistent, then that's. Okay. Aye. Okay, then fine, we'll vote on that. In the building owner throughout all classes A, B, C, and D, it's all in favor of removing the bracketed per unit statement? Say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Pardon? You opposed?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So the ayes have it.
Lawrence, would you prefer to have that per unit, this is Nancy Crumley, on each inspector, building owner, and contractor?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I mean, I guess that's kind of
It's the
what
same effect.
Same
It's
effect.
Same
Same
effect.
effect, either way, yeah.
It just gives you more teeth.
Well, then that's kind of why I was asking the question. If it makes it easier, but you said from an enforcement standpoint, it doesn't matter whether it says bracketed per unit or not. Or would it be clearer to all inspectors, building owners, and contractors that these violations is it clarity to have it bracketed, working through the legalese, having bracketed clear?
I think that's probably Mr. Taylor's
In the spirit
thought,
of
is that it's
unanimity, this is Scott Anderson, why don't we just add the bracket to contractors and inspectors also?
Works for me.
Okay.
I was waiting for the chairman to say that so that I could vote aye.
Okay, so then, all in favor of rescinding our previous vote, I'll say aye. Aye. Okay. So, then all board members in favor of adding the bracketed per unit of equipment to all classes for inspector, contractor, and owner, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you. All right. then-
Okay. I'm not sure what class we were discussing before we got into that.
We just finished A.
We were still on A?
Class A.
Yeah, we're good with A.
Had you voted on Class A already?
Delia, did we?
Yes.
Okay, so into Class B then. The first few violations under the Class B heading, you'll see they're struck through. Those, all 3 were moved up to Class C. Under inspection violations, you'll see things like failing to sign and date the inspection report. And remember, these are owner violations. Failing to obtain the inspection report from the inspector. This was previously in Class C, but we moved it down to Class B. Failing to obtain the services of an inspector registered with the department. This is kind of the mirror image, I suppose, of unlicensed activity. Not sure if that alarms you or not. Under plan review violations, failing to have the plans reviewed by the department before placing the equipment in service.
John McGraw, I've got only one comment. The fail to sign and date inspection report, I think that ought to be Class A.
Okay.
If at all. Most times, a failure to sign and date an inspection report is a simple oversight. Done it myself, I can't tell you how many times over the years. I'll have 10 elevator forms in front of me from one building. I'll sign 5 of them, I get sidetracked, I think I've signed them all, sent them out. You're not gonna issue me a certificate without them being signed anyway, they're coming back to me.
True.
Which slows the process down, we were talking about that earlier. I'm not so sure that unless you have a violation that needs to be brought into compliance, that there should even be any signature required, or at least, it's really kind of ludicrous to return these and to make it a Class B.
Okay.
In my opinion, is of no value.
Well,
Is
I
that
I guess on that item, any further discussion about moving that first bullet point, failed to sign and date inspection report to Class A? Any discussion? All board members in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? No opposition? Okay. I guess then the third bullet item, failed to obtain the services of an inspector registered with the department. I know that on the letters that TDLR sends out to building owners, it tells them the website to go to and tells the owner in that letter what they have to do, how they obtain a registered inspector. To me, that's pretty simple, pretty plain spelled out. So if the owner does not do that, is a Class B violation strong enough, or is that a Class C?
This is Lawrence Taylor. Correct me if I'm wrong. Just what I'm thinking is that this would just be an additional violation on the owner. He failed to have his equipment inspected. He failed to obtain the services of an inspector to do so. There's two separate violations. You can pile it on them a little bit if they're egregiously and have a history of doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, basically you pick up all 4 of those bullet points in one fell swoop.
There you go.
Yeah.
That's fine. Like I said, that's why we're all.
66. We're looking at the rule to see what the full language of the rule says. Are you 7466A3.
A3. Yeah. Obtain the services of an inspector registered with the department to perform inspections in accordance with 74.74 through 77.
Can you go up to the top of it to see where it starts? Oh, the owner must.
The owner must.
Yeah. And John McGraw here, I presume the intent of this is to knowingly, I mean, there are clearly instances where somebody could misrepresent themselves as a licensed inspector.
Right.
So it's not about that. It's knowingly and willfully not hiring an inspector.
It could be not hiring an inspector at all, or it could be hiring someone who
It's not qualified.
is not registered with us to perform an inspection. Although, as Mr. Anderson pointed out earlier, that's not going to get you very far because, we'll figure that out pretty quickly.
Going to be a little hard to file those forms without the.
Right.
All right. And I'm fine with that being in B. So any other comments about the Class B violations?
Not for me.
Okay. All board members in favor
I have
of,
one.
I'm sorry?
Lawrence has one.
Speak up.
This is Lawrence again. Under these plan review violations, now I'm sure it says in the rules that the owner's supposed to do it, but an owner can't, under the law and by rules, submit a plan review because that can only come from an elevator contractor. It seemed to me pretty hard for an elevator owner to violate that when they're not allowed to provide one in the first place.
That responsibility is placed on the owner as well as the contractor under the rules. The contractor has the obligation of actually submitting the documents to the department, but the owner has the obligation of not placing equipment in service before that's been done.
Well, again, but how would the owner know?
I don't know, but
This is clearly
that's
one of those issues
Yeah.
where it's like many times the owner's held responsible for something that they really don't have knowledge of, and it is what it is.
Well, then,
It's not always fair.
there you go. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Life ain't always fair.
Okay. So any other discussions on Class B items?
No.
Okay. All board members in favor of that change, of the one change of moving Class A, which we already voted on? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No opposition.
In Class C, there were a couple of provisions at the beginning that were struck through. The first and third of those were removed from the law. The second one, failed to obtain an inspection report from the inspector. We moved that down to Class B. That was in the category that we already talked about. Record keeping and administrative violations include things like failing to make required records available to the department or to contracted elevator personnel. Failure to store records in the required locations. Reporting violations include things like failing to report an accident to the department within 24 hours. That used to be in Class B, and we moved it here to Class C. failing to notify the department in writing within 30 days of corrections following a delay. Inspection violations, now remember this is the owner's matrix, but the category of inspection violations includes, obviously, failing to have each unit of equipment inspected annually, failing to have equipment with a reportable condition re-inspected and recertified before returning it to service. And there are a whole, a little list there of things, circumstances where it has to be re-inspected or tested before it's returned to service, like after alterations or after a delay.
John McGraw here, and just parroting Lawrence's earlier, fail to store records in a written or electronic format in the required locations. That may or may not be at the property owner's ability to do that. A lot of times those records may be kept off-site at the elevator contractors. They're not necessarily on-site, but we understand that you're going to make the property owner responsible for it, even if he's not responsible.
Well, this rule 7468 does place that obligation on the owner.
Oh, I understand that, and we argued about this when the rule was put in place, because the rule allows the contractor to actually keep the records on their servers in electronic format, and we're supposed to have access to them, but if the contractor fails to perform their duty, we're still responsible for it, even though it's outside of our control to maintain that. But, there again, it's just one of those things that life ain't always fair.
Is this a violation that you would like to see in a lower class?
I guess I kind of go with everybody else as well on that. I would prefer to see that in a lower class. The reality is, if in most cases, the owner is not going to store most of the records at their location. But what's your thoughts, Lawrence?
I don't disagree with you, sir.
The other issue is when the building sells and no records are transferred, this is Nancy Crumley, to
Yeah.
the new buyer. There's a break in the.
Yeah, we had these same arguments when these standards were being developed, and we just went, it wasn't really fair then to punish the owner, and it's probably not fair now to punish the owner, but I understand the buck has to stop somewhere. I think if we move that down a layer, moved it down to B, would be more appropriate.
Just the bottom violation? Just the
bottom violation, just the records, the storing of records. Okay. I think obviously there's no argument for denying access to back of the house areas or anything like that. That should be treated more severely.
Okay. So the recommendation is to move the bullet point, failed to store records in a written or electronic format in the request location to Class B.
Yes.
All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? No opposition. Okay.
Were there other suggested changes for this class?
Under the inspection violation, the first bullet, so I guess since now we have the bracketed per unit, I guess we don't really need to have underlined, we don't have, just failed to have equipment inspected annually. We need to have each unit in there? Or is that under that statute? Because that's a statute language too.
We probably made this change to clarify the violation according to the language of the statute. Since this is one of the violations that we penalize most often, I would prefer to have the language as it is, each unit of equipment.
Gives you a little
Yeah,
more,
there's the rule language. It's that way in the rule.
it gives you more teeth for enforcement.
Right. It doesn't give somebody an argument to make about. In Class C on the last page, under safety violations, you'll see the bottom two are italicized, and those relate to the rules that you just discussed today. Restoring power to equipment that had been removed from service without authorization, or returning it to service without an inspection. So those are, does that seem right for those to be in Class C?
John McGraw, my personal opinion is those ought to be in Class D. Those should be the strongest possible. There's absolutely no excuse for that.
Well, you can go to 5,000, it's already at 5,000, it can be up to 5,000.
Yeah, you don't really, up to 5,000. I guess
Right.
the max is the same, so it doesn't really matter.
But as noted, it gives the or the.
It gives enforcement just a little.
Discretion.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
I said leave it in C.
I think you ought to draw them and quarter them on the town square.
Well, that's right,
Yeah.
you can hit them for both of them, you can hit them for 2 violations, though.
Yeah.
And then, were there other suggestions about Class C? I don't think you voted on it as a
We have not,
class
no.
yet.
Nancy's looking at something.
I was trying to find 74-105D.
What's the new one? It's a new section.
Oh, that's true, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I can't find it.
Well, it's in your packet.
I just wondered on, this is Nancy, the very last bullet point, why it says why without an approved acceptance or annual inspection? If it doesn't have an acceptance inspection, it shouldn't be in service to begin with?
Pull up the draft.
Right,
Well,
'cause the
I've got the
acceptance
draft.
is the initial installation.
This was based on the draft rule language that was
Yeah, it's
published for comment.
so there's really-
Nancy, Jim Renan, he might, let's say a owner removes their elevator from service, then has a licensed contractor submit a plan review to do an alteration on it before
Okay.
it comes back, that's an acceptance inspection. It's not an annual.
It's an alterations inspection, isn't it?
Well, acceptance. Acceptance is for an alteration or a brand-new elevator, either one.
Okay.
So,
I didn't think about that,
There you go.
alterations. Thank you.
And it is stated that way in the draft rule language that you approved today.
Can we just reaffirm we'd like that language? Okay. So, I'm lost, are we, okay, so,
Move to approve C?
yeah, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? No opposition? And then Class D, any
In-
discussion?
In Class D, I need to request a correction. We left out 2 violations that I think could appropriately be here for owners, and they are similar to violations that we have in the contractors and the inspectors. If you look at Class D for contractors, for example, you'll see violated a previous order of the commission or executive director. That is something that a building owner could do. That is something that building owners have done in the past. So I think that one should appropriately be here. Obtaining or attempting to obtain a registration by fraud, that's not something an owner can do, so we don't need to worry about that one. But then failing to pay the department for a dishonored payment, that's
Yeah.
possible that an owner could commit that violation because they do pay fees to the department. So
This
my-
is Lawrence. That one about obtain or attempted to obtain a registration by fraud or false representation. If I remember right, there was one owner who went on the website, printed out an inspection report, signed an inspector's name to it, signed his name to it, and sent it in. Wouldn't that be misrepresentation and false if something like that occurred?
Yep.
Yeah, he would be attempting to obtain
Registration.
a certificate.
Certificate.
Because
by
all that
fraud.
stuff is online. If I remember right, that person went online, picked out the form, printed it off, went to the inspector's registration list, picked out an inspector's name, got his certification number, put it on there, signed it, and sent it in, and never had it done.
Okay,
I'd say leave both of them on there.
so,
I have a question. In today's world, this is Nancy, if they did just what Lawrence described, would it not, that mailed-in form, would it not match up with a a missing 72-hour.
Yeah, the online
today.
reporting.
The online reporting, it would.
That's right.
It wouldn't match up, so there would be a red flag.
That would red flag it immediately.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
That's how you would catch it, but they
Yeah.
still attempted to
Exactly.
do it.
Right, yeah.
But the violation was already there by.
Doesn't mean people aren't stupid.
Yeah, so leave it in D. Or
Add it to D.
add
Right.
it to D.
Yeah.
So in addition to the one violation that's already there, I would request that you take the same 3 violations that are in Class D in the other 2 matrices and include them here as well.
And change registration to certificate. Or, is that registration? Should be
Would you pull up, or we don't have Chapter 60 rules pulled up, do we? Because the citation to Chapter 60, 60.23A1 is probably broader than the language in the elevator statute, and it might cover license, certificate, registration, all kinds of stuff. Or procedural rules, the one up above, yeah. 6023.
A1.
It just uses the word license. I think the word, look in definitions and see if the word license is defined to include a whole bunch of stuff. I think it is. I'm sorry, we're having our own little meander through the rules here. Yeah.
Okay.
License is defined to include all that stuff, so I think if we change the word registration to license, it'll be fine.
Okay. So,
Is that acceptable to you to move those 3 violations over and add them there as well?
all board members in favor of that change on Class D, say aye.
Aye.
In opposition? And no opposition. Okay, I think that concludes the penalty matrices. Okay, Christina, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and board members. This was a lot easier than I thought.
Agenda item J, discuss and possible recommendation regarding appointment advisory board work group to review all elevator-related forms, make recommendations. Any board member have a suggestion for any work groups?
Why is this on the agenda?
Because we always do.
It's just a standard.
A standard, okay.
Yeah.
I just didn't know if there was a
Yeah, it's
specific
standard, you know.
reason.
It's a placeholder.
No,
Okay.
if we decide to do a work group, then it's not on the agenda, so we have to wait another, basically 2 meetings.
I remember it's been a long time since I've reviewed that statement, right?
This is a
Yep.
David Gonzalez, Compliance Division. I am before an all-volunteer advisory board to get volunteers. We are actually trying to pursue the bill implementation for the place out of service. The changes to the form will allow us to take all this paperwork in and streamline it. When we were doing this process, we decided, hey, we can also capture data that Mr. Taylor was so nice to point out. It would be better if we maybe could clarify a few things. We've already done research with other states on how they did their forms, but instead of working inside of a glass and keeping our blinders on, we'd like to include the work group, if at all possible, get y'all's input so that when we change our forms, we do it once, we do it right. So we're looking for volunteers. It cannot be more than 4 individuals, I think, because this is a advisory board of 9, so it can't be more than a quorum. So no more than 4 individuals to participate in a work group so that we can review all of our forms and update them to the best of our abilities.
And Brian Francis, we'll be more direct, and Dave, thank you for being not as direct, but we'll be more direct. We need to make changes to the inspection report form.
That's why I
We
was
need it to
asking.
flow, and we need it to make sense. We've made some efforts internally to look at other states and cobble together what we think would be the best form one that definitely works with the QEIs. We're going to need their involvement on it, and we want to stop working in the vacuum and get some other eyes on it before we move forward with that project that could be, that could impact a lot of folks. So that's what we want the folks on involved.
I guess then, Brian, I have a question. So the board has never reviewed or acted on any of the forms?
Mhm.
So the product of this work group, will that just be implemented, or do we have to wait till we have another meeting and review it, and another
It's going to be
meeting
implemented
review it?
because
Okay.
we're really just getting the eyes, and it's going to allow us to say, this makes sense,
Okay.
the direction we're going in. We'll have a communication rollout plan, so it's not going to be, the work group meets, and tomorrow we have new forms. It's going to be the work group meets, we get the forms, we run it back by them, and then we say 4 inspections completed 3 months down the road, so that the world knows that these things are going to be introduced at a reasonable but a metered pace.
Hey,
Okay.
David.
Yes, sir.
This is Lawrence. Would the development of these new forms be with the thought in the back of somebody's mind that, praise the Lord, we would eventually be able to do everything
Online.
electronically and not have to have paper forms and do away with that? Is
One certainly hopes so.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
The answer is yes.
Well, then, if that's the case, I'll be glad to volunteer to serve.
Thank you, Lawrence.
So we have two volunteers so far, Nancy Crumley and Lawrence Taylor. And the work group name is Review All Forms?
Elevator forms, I guess, right?
Make sure to point that out, because
Equipment.
I wasn't as direct, but the word "all" was really looming large out there. It is all the forms that we have. Inspections is the most important because we have a statutory change that goes along with it. So that is the crux of what we want to get to. But it's all the forms that we have to make sure that they're on board.
Yeah, but it's not only, it's not necessarily, it's equipment forms.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so.
This is Lawrence again. We're not talking about all agency forms. We're just talking
No,
about
just
elevators.
elevator program forms.
Yeah.
And the
We're
purview
we're
of-
looking at those tied to the
You don't
inspection
wanna be
reports and the
part of
contract
it.
Purview of this
reports.
administrative
You and the
board.
barbers and.
We'll put y'all to work.
Okay, so far Nancy Crumley and Lawrence Taylor have volunteered. Any other volunteers?
We need a third to break a tie.
Absolutely.
That's not a requirement around my home. I don't know why I would be here.
Usually on David Gonzalez, usually when I participate in volunteering, if I don't show up for a meeting, they usually get
Yeah, I was
volunteered.
thinking Grayson looks like a great candidate.
Okay.
Yeah, Grayson left, he's.
I heard him volunteer before he left, though.
Stand about to raise your hand.
Okay.
I really would not add anything to that, so I'm.
Okay. All right. Well, then I would volunteer for that. That'd be interesting exercise. Okay, so I guess we have three volunteers for the work group? You say non-paying, right?
Non-paid, all
You started out
volunteer.
with volunteer, that's definition.
We may
Christina,
convince,
is that a definition, volunteer?
we may spring for cookies or chips every once in a while, but if we have them, it'll just be us eating them, because typically we try to do these, not having y'all travel, we'll do them via either webinar type situation or voicemail and make it easier for you. But if we have y'all here, I'll spring for cookies and sandwiches.
Free drinks too, Brian. There's a water fountain at the end of each hall. Just say free
All
drinks.
right. Okay, thank you all for that. And then staff will be in touch with their timeline and scheduling this. I assume we'd be kind of marching through it a few forms at a time. And
David Gonzalez, yes, I'll probably be the point person along with our compliance staff, and we'll be working with licensing staff. But yes, we will be contacting you to coordinate those efforts and coordinate with y'all what's convenient time-wise and set up dates and all those things.
Okay, thank you. Any other recommendations for any other work groups? Okay, so with that silence, no other recommendations. Agenda item K, recommendation for agenda items for next board meeting.
Well, Mr. Chairman, there's not a pressing need like we had with the advisory boards, but one of the things I want to acknowledge is that having the space between the meetings like we did with 2013 is probably not acceptable. So maybe looking at a meeting somewhere in April or May, but on that agenda, I've already jumped to, to L. We'll definitely have the work group report coming back to you, would be one of the main things on there. We'll probably be talking about strategic planning, trying to figure out things we can do better at the agency. But I don't know if there's anything else looming at this point in time that impacts the elevator industry.
I don't think so either, other than just our standard format
Yes, sir.
of
Staff reports and those
staff
things,
reports
absolutely.
and just anything else that we may dream up or think about. wanted
I think there's a
recommend
hand down there,
changes on the rules.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, this is Lawrence Taylor again. How about adding the adoption of the 2013 elevator code in the next agenda so that we can make some progress towards that, because we're already 8 years behind.
Absolutely.
2013 elevator.
Sorry, putting the minutes together. This is fantastic.
Yeah, I know I got an accent, but it's A 17.1 dash 2013.
Accents are plenty in this room today.
Okay. Agenda item L, discussion and date, time, location of upcoming board meeting. The location would be this room, I assume.
Yes, sir.
So as Brian mentioned, there's no pressing needs, but we're to meet if there are things to meet about, and so you're proposing February timeframe, or maybe, I'm sorry, April.
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 April, May.
And
April, May. Okay.
we'll look to the members as we get closer if that.
And no later than 2016
No,
sometime.
exactly. There's no 2092 next meeting.
We gotta do something before next session.
Yeah,
That's exactly
You
right.
know there's gonna be stuff in session.
Just so I can remember what we did.
You can make that motion on the minutes with confidence.
Yeah.
All right, this has been a little bit of a lengthy meeting for us, but after 2 years, we have a little bit of ground to cover. We
That's
had to
good.
get training, the matrices, the penalty matrices is very important. So at this time, thank you everybody for your time and patience and attendance, and we will adjourn at 5:05. Thanks.
Great.